Story 1. I stopped supporting my brother's family. After he said, "You're a burden to us." Christmas was always my favorite time of year. This time I had planned ahead. No last-minute shopping, no frantic rushes to grab gifts. By the first week of December, I had already bought presents for my parents, my brother Jacob, his wife Kelly, and their kids. I even picked up a few extra gifts, just in case there were unexpected guests. Something about this year felt different, like it was going to be a good one. But the moment I stepped onto my parents' front porch, holding 2 big bags of carefully wrapped gifts, I knew something was off. Mom answered the door, her face unreadable. Then, before I could step inside, she uttered words I never expected to hear. "We don't want you here this year." At first, I thought it was some kind of twisted joke. I let out a nervous chuckle, waiting for her to break into laughter. But before she could say anything else, Jacob's voice cut through the air from inside the house. "This is no place for losers. You're really starting to wear on all of us." I just stood there, my breath caught in my throat. My father was in the background, avoiding my gaze, looking at anything but me. Mom seemed uneasy too, but she didn't take it back. And Jacob. He stood tall, arms crossed, his usual smug arrogance written all over his face. A rush of emotions hit me, shock, anger, confusion, but I swallowed them down. I wouldn't let them see me break. "Fine," I said with a stiff nod, turning back to my car. But as I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the gifts piled in the passenger seat, my mind raced. No place for losers? Tired of me? Where was this coming from? For years I had done nothing but help Jacob and his family. I paid for his kids' summer camps, covered their school supplies, even helped with their mortgage when things got tight. And now suddenly I wasn't welcome? I needed answers. So instead of driving away, I got out and marched back to the house. They hadn't even shut the door. My parents were still whispering, and Jacob was lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, stepping inside. "Why am I not welcome? What did I do?" Jacob smirked, barely looking up from his phone. "You really don't get it, do you? You've been slacking off lately. The kids have barely gotten anything from you this year." I blinked. "What are you talking about? I spend hundreds on gifts for them, more than anyone else." Jacob finally set his phone down, meeting my gaze with a bored expression. "Last year you did more. This year? It's like you don't even care. It's embarrassing for us, honestly." I turned to my parents, expecting them to step in, to tell Jacob he was being ridiculous. But instead, my mom gave me an awkward smile. "But you just bought a new car," she pointed out. "You found money for that." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "The car is on credit," I said slowly. "And even if it wasn't, what does that have to do with anything? How does buying a car make me responsible for Jacob's kids? They're not mine." Jacob leaned back against the couch, stretching like this whole conversation was boring him. "You make the most money," he said simply. "Families help each other. You've always done that." I glanced at his wife, Kelly, who sat quietly in the corner. Her face was flushed, her eyes downcast, her hands twisting in her lap. She wasn't saying a word, but she looked ashamed. "So let me get this straight," I said, exhaling sharply. "Because I was generous in the past, I'm now obligated to keep doing it forever? And if I don't, I'm a loser?" Jacob shrugged. "If the shoe fits." That was it. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I turned to my parents, my voice calm but firm. "You know what? You're right. I don't belong here." Then I turned to Jacob. "Enjoy your Christmas and good luck with those presents, because this loser is done." I walked out without another word. I drove home in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly my fingers ached. My mind replayed the scene over and over. Mom's hesitant expression, Dad's refusal to meet my eyes, and Jacob's smug, entitled attitude. The weight of it all pressed down on me. I had spent years bending over backward for them. And for what? To be discarded the second they decided I wasn't useful anymore? When I finally pulled into my driveway, my hands were shaking with rage. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. No more anger, no more second chances. I stepped inside, dropped the bags of gifts onto the kitchen table and stared at them. Just hours ago, I had been excited about Christmas, about seeing my family, exchanging presents, sharing a meal. Now, these gifts were just reminders of how little I actually mattered to them. I pulled out my phone, opened a group chat with my parents and Jacob, and typed a message. Me, I understand now. My value to you has never been about who I am, only what I can provide. That ends today. Don't call, don't text, I'm done. I hit send. Almost immediately my phone buzzed. Jacob. I let it ring, then Mom, then Dad. I ignored them all. A text from Mom popped up. Honey, don't be like this, it's Christmas. Jacob followed with, Stop being dramatic, you're embarrassing yourself. I scoffed. I was embarrassing myself? Jacob, a grown man who depended on me like I was his personal ATM, had the audacity to call me embarrassing? Without hesitation, I blocked them all. Then I grabbed the bags of gifts, loaded them into my car, and drove across town to a local children's shelter. If my so-called family didn't appreciate my generosity, there were plenty of kids who would. When I arrived, the shelter coordinator, a kind woman in her 50s, greeted me with a warm smile. Are you donating these? She asked, eyeing the bags. Yeah, I said, my voice rough. They were meant for my family, but turns out they don't deserve them. She gave me a knowing look, but didn't pry. Well, you're making a lot of kids happy tonight. For the first time that day, something inside me eased. As I drove home, I realized something. I didn't feel sad, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. Update: the fallout. A week passed. I ignored every attempt my family made to contact me. They left voicemails, sent emails, even had relatives reach out on their behalf. I didn't respond. Then, just before New Year's, my dad showed up at my door. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. He looked older, more tired than I had ever seen him. His shoulders sagged like he was carrying a weight too heavy for him. "Can we talk?" he asked, rubbing the back of his neck. I leaned against the doorframe. "That depends. Are you here to guilt-trip me or actually listen?" He sighed. "Your mother is upset. She didn't want things to turn out like this." I let out a dry laugh. "She stood there and let Jacob call me a loser. She let you stay silent. And now you're worried about how she feels?" Dad hesitated. "You have to understand, Jacob has always needed more help. He struggles with things." I scoffed. "He struggles?" "Dad, I busted my ass for everything I have. I didn't ask for handouts. I didn't expect special treatment. But Jacob, he's been mooching off everyone for years, and you let him. Hell, you encourage it." He had no response to that. "Let me guess," I continued. "You came here to convince me to make amends, to be the bigger person because it's family, right?" Dad exhaled sharply. "I just don't want this to break the family apart." I folded my arms. Newsflash, the family was broken long before I walked away. I was just too blind to see it. He looked down at the ground, silent. "I'm not changing my mind," I said firmly. "I'm done. If you want a relationship with me, fine. But it won't be on Jacob's terms, and I'm not giving him another damn cent." For a long moment, Dad said nothing. Then, finally, he nodded. "I understand," he murmured, but I could tell he didn't like it. That was fine. I didn't care anymore. For the first time in my life, I was standing up for myself, and I wasn't backing down. New Year's came and went in silence. No calls, no texts. It was the most peaceful holiday I had in years. Then, about a week into January, I got an email from Jacob. Subject: "You're being selfish." Jacob: "So this is it? You're really cutting off your family over some dumb Christmas drama? You've been acting like a spoiled brat, and Mom and Dad don't deserve this. You know they rely on you, right? Dad's getting older and Mom's stressed enough without your little tantrum. But sure, keep pretending you're some kind of victim." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting in disgust. They rely on me? What about me? For years, I had been their safety net. Every time Jacob messed up, every time my parents were in a bind, I was there. I helped with bills, gave loans I never saw repaid, covered for Jacob's mistakes. And now that I had stopped, now I was selfish? I closed the email without responding. A few days later, Kelly, Jacob's wife, reached out. Unlike Jacob, she didn't send a nasty email. She called. I let it go to voicemail at first, but she kept trying. On the fourth call, I finally picked up. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Hey." She sounded hesitant, almost embarrassed. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I just wanted to talk." I didn't say anything, so she continued. "Look, I know Jacob can be difficult, and I know what happened at Christmas wasn't fair to you. But things have been really hard lately. He's under a lot of pressure." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Kelly, I don't know what you expect me to do with that information. Jacob's always under pressure. He's always struggling. And yet somehow he still finds the energy to treat me like crap." She sighed. "I get it. I do. But he's my husband, and I have to stand by him. I don't want things to get worse between all of you." There it was. The real reason she called. "You mean you don't want to lose the financial support?" I said bluntly. Kelly was silent for a long moment. "That's not," she started. But I cut her off. "Be honest, Kelly. You've been married to Jacob for years. You know what he's like. You know he expects people to clean up his messes. And now that I've stopped, you're scared of what happens next. Right?" Another pause. Then finally she whispered, "Yeah." I sighed, my frustration shifting into something closer to pity. "I get that this is hard for you, but I can't keep sacrificing myself for Jacob. If you want to keep bailing him out, that's your choice. But I'm done." "I understand," she said quietly. And for the first time, I think she really did. Update: the inevitable begging. By mid-February, I had settled into my new reality, one where I no longer answered Jacob's calls, no longer got dragged into my family's financial disasters, no longer felt obligated to fix things. Then one day my phone rang. It was Mom. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" "Oh, sweetheart," she exclaimed, relief flooding her voice. "You finally picked up. I've been so worried about you." I leaned against my counter. "What do you need, Mom?" There was a pause. Then hesitantly, "Well, things have been tough lately. Your brother's struggling and your dad and well, we've had some unexpected expenses. We were just wondering if—" I laughed. Actually laughed. "Let me stop you right there," I said, shaking my head. "I know exactly where this is going, and the answer is no." "But no, Mom. You only reached out because you need money, not because you miss me, not because you regret what happened, just because you need something from me, like always." She sputtered. "That's not fair. We do miss you. You just thought I'd be dumb enough to open my wallet again," I interrupted. "Well, I'm not. You made your choice at Christmas and I made mine. Don't call me again unless it's for something that doesn't involve money." I hung up before she could respond, and this time I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel guilty. I just felt done. March rolled around, and for the first time in years my life felt peaceful. No sudden phone calls demanding money, no guilt trips, no obligations that weren't my own. I had finally broken free. Then one evening I got a text from an unknown number. "Unknown, hey, it's Dad. Please call me when you can." I stared at the message for a long moment. I hadn't blocked him like I had Mom and Jacob, but we hadn't spoken since he showed up at my door after Christmas. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part, one I wasn't proud of, felt a twinge of concern. So I called. He picked up on the first ring. "Son, thank God." "What's going on?" I asked warily. "It's Jacob." I sighed, already regretting making the call. "What did he do now?" "He lost his job," Dad admitted. "And Kelly, well, she left him." That made me pause. "Kelly left?" "Yeah," Dad said, his voice heavy. "She took the kids and moved in with her sister. She said she couldn't do it anymore, that she was tired of being married to someone who refuses to grow up." I exhaled slowly. "I can't say I'm surprised." "I know," Dad murmured. "But Jacob, he's not taking it well. He's in a bad place. He's drinking a lot, staying out all night. Your mom's beside herself." I pinched the bridge of my nose. And what do you expect me to do about it? Dad hesitated. I thought maybe if you reached out, tried to talk some sense into him. I cut him off with a bitter laugh. Oh, so now I'm good enough to be part of the family again? Now that Jacob's life is falling apart, suddenly I'm useful. It's not like that, son. Like that. It's exactly like that, I snapped. You all made it clear where I stood, and I meant it when I said I was done. Jacob is not my responsibility. If he wants to drink himself into a hole, that's his choice. I won't be the one to pull him out. Dad let out a heavy sigh. I just don't want to lose both my sons. That one stung. I hesitated. Swallowing down the complicated emotions his words stirred up. Then maybe you should have thought about that before siding with Jacob every single time, I said quietly. I know, Dad admitted. I know we failed you, and I won't pretend I can fix that overnight, but I wanted to try. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. I appreciate that, Dad, I finally said, but I'm not fixing Jacob, not this time. Dad didn't argue. He just sighed again and muttered, I understand. For once I actually believed him. Update. A glimpse of closure. A few weeks passed without incident. Then, one afternoon, I got an unexpected call from Kelly. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the best of me. Hey, I said cautiously. Hey, she echoed. I wanted to say thank you. That threw me off. For what? For standing your ground, for showing me that I didn't have to keep enabling Jacob. She let out a humorless chuckle. I guess it took you walking away for me to realize I needed to do the same. I leaned back in my chair, taking that in. Are you and the kids okay? We will be, she said, her voice steadier than I expected. It's hard, but honestly, it's a relief. I should have left years ago. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Yeah, I get that. There was a brief silence before she spoke again. For what it's worth, I think Jacob's finally starting to realize he's screwed up. I arched a brow. You really think so? I don't know, she admitted. But he hit rock bottom, and sometimes that's what it takes for people to change. I wasn't holding my breath. Anyway, she said, clearing her throat. I won't take up more of your time. Just take care of yourself, okay? You too, Kelly, I said sincerely. As I hung up, I realized something. For the first time in a long, long time, I didn't feel angry anymore. Spring rolled in, and with it came a sense of finality. It had been months since I cut ties with my family, and life had never been quieter. No frantic calls, no last-minute financial rescues, no guilt weighing me down. For the first time, my money was mine. My time was mine. My peace was mine. But then one last unexpected message came through. It was from Jacob. Jacob, I get it now. I screwed up. I pushed too hard and I took you for granted. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it. I'm sorry. I stared at the text for a long time. If he had sent this 6 months ago, maybe even 3 months ago, I might have jumped at the chance to fix things. But now, I felt nothing. Not anger, not resentment, just nothing. I had already grieved the loss of my family. I had already made peace with it. This apology, whether sincere or just another manipulation, didn't change anything. I didn't reply. Instead, I did something else. I went out and lived my life. Final update. A life without them. Summer came. I took a vacation. A real one for the first time in years. No one called me in the middle of it asking for money. No one made me feel guilty for spending on myself instead of them. I made new friends. I strengthened old friendships. I built something for myself instead of being the foundation for everyone else. And you know what? It felt amazing. I still think about them sometimes, about my parents, about Jacob. I wonder if they'll ever truly change. I wonder if they'll ever realize that I wasn't the problem, they were. But I don't dwell on it, because I've finally learned something. Family isn't about blood. It's about respect. It's about effort. It's about love that isn't conditional on what you can provide. And if they couldn't give me that, then I didn't need them. I was finally free, and I wasn't looking back. Story 2. My bride ghosted me 2 weeks before our wedding for a secret trip with her old college circle. I never thought I'd be the guy sitting here, typing out my misery for strangers to read. But life has a way of pulling the rug out from under you when you least expect it. So here I am, trying to make sense of everything. My name's Jake. I'm 27. And up until 2 weeks ago, I thought my life was finally falling into place. I was engaged to Rachel, 26, the woman I had loved for 7 years. 7 whole years, man. That's a quarter of my life. Everything was set. The venue booked, the flowers ordered, the guest list finalized. In my mind, I was days away from stepping into the life I'd always imagined. Rachel and I met back in college. She was a freshman and I was a sophomore. The first time I saw her, she was sitting on the campus lawn, laughing at something with her friends. She had this kind of glow about her, like the kind of person who could light up an entire room just by existing. I know it sounds corny, but it's true. She was the kind of girl you didn't just meet, you remembered. We started dating after a few so-called study sessions that were more about me making excuses to spend time with her than actual studying. Over the years, we survived the highs and lows together. Exam stress, job hunts, that ridiculous phase where I thought growing a beard would make me look more rugged. Spoiler, it didn't. She was my rock, my safe place, the one person I could count on no matter what. When I finally popped the question last year, it wasn't some over-the-top proposal. It was simple, heartfelt, just the way we were. I took her back to the little 24-hour diner where we had our first date, ordered her favorite strawberry milkshake, and slid the ring across the table. She teared up before I could even finish asking. That night I felt like I had everything I ever wanted. And then 2 weeks before our wedding she disappeared. It started small. A change so subtle I almost missed it. Rachel had always been a perfectionist when it came to planning, down to the tiniest detail. She spent weeks making sure every guest had the perfect seat, balancing friend groups, making sure her wild college friends weren't near her conservative aunt. It was just who she was. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, she started checking out. She was spending more nights out, brushing me off with, "You don't mind, do you?" Of course I said I didn't. I didn't want to seem controlling. But deep down, it stung. I told myself it was just stress. Weddings can be overwhelming, right? Maybe she needed a little space. That night, while finalizing the seating chart, she kept glancing at her phone, smiling at messages before quickly locking the screen when I looked her way. I told myself not to be that guy, the one who gets suspicious over nothing. I trusted her. I was an idiot. The next morning she was gone. No note, no explanation. I figured she was just out for coffee or running errands. Nothing unusual. But by lunchtime, when I still hadn't heard from her, I felt that gut-wrenching unease settle in. I shot her a quick text. "Morning, where'd you head off to?" No response. By 2 p.m., I tried again. "Everything okay? Haven't heard from you all day." Nothing. I called her, straight to voicemail. Rachel wasn't the type to just vanish. Even when she was swamped with wedding stuff, she'd at least send a quick, busy, love you text. I called her mom next, hoping maybe she was with her. Her mom sounded confused. "Rachel? No, sweetheart, I haven't seen her today." And that's when I knew something was wrong. At first I tried to stay rational. Maybe her phone died. Maybe she got caught up with something and lost track of time. But as the hours passed, that little voice in my head started screaming that something wasn't right. I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, willing it to light up with a text from her. Nothing. By 6 p.m., panic started to set in. I called her closest friends. No one had seen her. I even drove by her favorite coffee shop just in case. Nothing. By the time I got back home, I was pacing the living room like a caged animal. My brain was cycling through every worst-case scenario. Had she been in an accident? Did she get cold feet about the wedding? Or was there someone else? I hated myself for even thinking it, but once the idea crept in, I couldn't shake it. Then out of nowhere, my phone buzzed. "Rachel. Hey, sorry, just been really busy. Talk later?" That was it. No explanation, no apology, just casual indifference. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking with frustration. I texted back immediately. "Rachel, where have you been? I've been calling all day. Are you okay?" Minutes passed, then an hour. No response. And in that silence, something in me snapped. I knew, in that moment, that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't stress or wedding jitters. Something was very, very wrong. And I was going to find out exactly what it was. I barely slept that night. My mind was running in circles, trying to make sense of Rachel's disappearance. Every time I closed my eyes, my brain replayed the past few weeks, searching for anything I might have missed. Some sign, some clue. I had to talk to her. The next morning I called her again. Straight to voicemail. I sent another text. No response. I wasn't about to sit around waiting for answers. By mid-morning, I decided to drive over to her place. Rachel had an apartment she kept as her personal space, even though we spent most nights together at my place. She claimed she needed somewhere quiet to work from home sometimes, and I never questioned it. Now I was questioning everything. When I got there, I knocked, no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I pulled out my phone and called her one more time. Through the door, I heard it. Her phone ringing. My stomach dropped. I knocked again. "Rachel, I know you're in there!" Silence. I wasn't leaving until I got some answers. After another minute, I heard shuffling, and then, finally, the door cracked open. Rachel stood there, looking different. Her hair was messy, and she was wearing sweatpants and an oversized hoodie. Nothing like the usual put-together, stylish Rachel I knew. But what really threw me off was her expression. She looked guilty. "What the hell, Rachel?" I said, pushing the door open wider. "Where have you been?" She sighed and stepped aside to let me in. "Jake, I just needed some space." "Space?" I repeated, my voice rising. "For what? You ghosted me for a whole day. Do you have any idea how worried I was?" She avoided my eyes. "I'm sorry, I should have texted more." I ran a hand through my hair, trying to stay calm. "Rachel, what's going on? Just talk to me." She hesitated. I just needed time to think. About everything. The wedding, us." I took a step back, like I'd been punched in the gut. "Are you saying you don't want to get married?" "No," she said quickly. "I do. I don't know, Jake. It's all been so much." I narrowed my eyes. "And you needed space by completely ignoring me? That doesn't make any sense, Rachel." She sighed and finally looked up at me. "I went on a trip." I blinked. "A trip?" "Yeah, with some of my college friends, just for a couple of days." I felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. "You mean to tell me you disappeared, without telling me, for a little vacation?" "I didn't think it was a big deal," she snapped. "I just needed a break, Jake. Some time to clear my head before the wedding." My jaw clenched. "Rachel, do you hear yourself? You took off without a word, ignored my calls, and now you're acting like I'm overreacting?" She sighed dramatically. "I just didn't want to deal with more stress. I thought you'd understand." "Understand what?" I shot back. "That you can just take off, ignore me, and expect everything to be fine?" She crossed her arms, suddenly defensive. "I don't know why you're making this such a big deal. It's not like I cheated on you." I froze, because I hadn't brought up cheating. She did. And the way she said it? Like it was the first thing on her mind. "Why would you even say that?" I asked slowly. Rachel's face paled. "What? No, I just meant I knew you'd think the worst." I stared at her, my stomach twisting. Something was definitely wrong. "Rachel," I said, keeping my voice steady, "where exactly did you go, and who was with you?" She hesitated. "Just my friends, Melissa, Katie, Jenna." I folded my arms. "And?" She chewed her lip. "And Josh." My stomach dropped. "Josh, her ex-boyfriend from college." I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides. "Are you kidding me?" "It wasn't like that, Jake!" she rushed out. "It was just a group trip. Nothing happened." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You expect me to believe that? You disappear without a word, go on a secret trip, and your ex just so happens to be there?" "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react like this," she snapped. "Oh, so this is my fault now?" I shot back. "You didn't tell me because you knew it was wrong, Rachel. You knew how it would look." She groaned, rubbing her temples. "Can we not do this right now?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "You know what, Rachel? No, we are doing this right now, because I need to know. Do you still want to marry me?" She looked at me, eyes wide. "Of course I do!" I studied her face, trying to believe her, trying to believe that the woman I loved wasn't lying to me. But something in my gut told me she wasn't telling me the full truth, and I was going to find out exactly what she was hiding. I left Rachel's apartment feeling like someone had kicked me in the chest. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything she had just said. A secret trip with her college friends, including her ex-boyfriend Josh? And she didn't think it was a big deal? Yeah, no. Something wasn't adding up. I got into my car and just sat there for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel. The part that bothered me the most wasn't even that she went on the trip. It was how she acted when I confronted her. The defensiveness, the guilt in her eyes, the way she immediately mentioned cheating when I hadn't even brought it up. I had two choices. I could either believe her and try to move on like nothing had happened, or I could get to the bottom of this myself. Guess which one I chose? The first person I called was Melissa, one of Rachel's closest college friends. I had met her plenty of times, and while we weren't exactly friends, she had always been nice enough. I figured if anyone was going to be honest with me, it would be her. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. "Hey, Jake, what's up?" she answered, sounding a little too cheerful. "Hey, Melissa. Listen, I just talked to Rachel. She mentioned you guys went on a trip last week." Silence. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. "Oh, yeah, we did," she said quickly. "It was just a little getaway. Super last minute." "Where'd you guys go?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Miami." "Miami? Rachel told me she had gone to Denver." I felt my jaw tighten. "Huh, that's weird. Rachel said Denver." Another pause. "Oh yeah, we stopped in Denver on the way," Melissa added hastily. "We, did a little road trip thing." Now I knew she was lying. No way in hell was Rachel doing a road trip days before our wedding. I leaned back in my seat, gripping my phone tighter. "And Josh was there too?" Melissa hesitated again. "Yeah, but it wasn't a big deal, Jake. We're all just friends." I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Melissa, be honest with me. Did something happen between Rachel and Josh?" The line was dead silent. Then she let out a nervous laugh. "Jake, I really think you should talk to Rachel about this." That was all I needed to hear. I hung up without another word. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I drove around for a while, trying to get my thoughts in order. Rachel had lied to me. That much was obvious. But the worst part? The people covering for her weren't even good at it. They were fumbling through excuses, contradicting themselves left and right. It was clear as day. Something had happened on that trip, and I was done playing dumb. I drove back to Rachel's apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. This time I didn't bother knocking. I used the spare key she had given me months ago. She was sitting on the couch when I walked in, her phone in her hands. When she saw me, her eyes widened. "Jake, what are you—" I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Melissa told me you were in Miami." Rachel froze. Her face went pale. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what I thought." "Jake, I can explain," she started, her voice shaking. I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, this I gotta hear. Because first, you ghost me for a whole day. Then you casually mention that your ex was on the trip. And now, I find out you lied about where you even went." Rachel's hands were trembling. "Just tell me the truth, Rachel," I said, my voice quieter now. "If you still love me, if you still want to marry me, then tell me the damn truth." She swallowed hard, and then finally she said it. "I slept with Josh." It felt like the whole world tilted. I took a step back, shaking my head. "You're joking." She started crying. "It wasn't planned. I didn't go there thinking it would happen. It just—" "Don't." My voice came out sharp. "Don't stand there and tell me it just happened. You chose to go, you chose to lie, and you chose to cheat." Rachel buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "I was scared, Jake. Everything was moving so fast, and I freaked out. I needed to feel, I don't know, free for a second." I let out a bitter laugh. "Free? You wanted to feel free?" She lifted her head, eyes red and puffy. "I love you, Jake. I do. But I got scared. And I messed up. Please, can we talk about this?" Talk about this? There was nothing to talk about. I had spent 7 years loving this woman, planning a future with her, trusting her. And in return, she had spent a weekend in Miami with her ex, lying to my face the whole way through. I took a deep breath, forcing down the lump in my throat. "No, Rachel," I said finally. "We can't talk about this because we're done." She let out a choked sob. "Jake, please!" I turned around and walked out the door. And for the first time in weeks, I felt completely sure about something. Rachel was out of my life. For good. I'd like to say that after I walked out of Rachel's apartment, I never looked back, that I held my head high, moved on with my life, and never wasted another second on her. But that would be a lie. The truth? I felt like my whole world had collapsed. 7 years, down the drain. One minute I was planning a future with her, and the next I was sitting in my car, staring at the steering wheel, trying not to lose my damn mind. The next few days were a blur. I ignored Rachel's calls and texts, because yeah, she had the nerve to keep reaching out. First, it was the desperate apologies. Then it was the "I miss you" messages. By day 3, she was begging me to talk to her. I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on canceling the wedding, calling the venue, the caterers, the florist. Each call was like ripping off a fresh bandage, reminding me just how much time, energy, and money I had wasted on someone who didn't deserve me. Then came the worst part, telling everyone. My parents were devastated. My mom, who had always adored Rachel, kept asking if I was sure. "Maybe she just made a mistake, honey. Are you sure this is something you can't work through?" "Mom, she slept with her ex 2 weeks before our wedding," I reminded her. She sighed. "I just don't understand why she would throw everything away like that." Yeah, me neither. Telling my friends was easier. Most of them were pissed on my behalf. My best friend Ethan was especially furious. "Dude, I never liked her," he admitted after I told him what happened. "She always had this fake thing going on. Like she was playing the role of the perfect fiancé, but underneath she was a mess." I wished he'd told me that before I spent 7 years with her. The hardest part? Returning all the wedding gifts. Every time I boxed up another blender, coffee maker, or picture frame with our names engraved on it, it felt like I was shoving my relationship into a trash bag. And maybe that's exactly what I was doing. I managed to go 4 days without seeing Rachel in person. On the 5th day, she showed up at my place. It was 9 p.m. I had just settled onto my couch with a beer, trying to numb my brain with some mindless TV when I heard the knock. I knew it was her before I even opened the door. She looked like hell. Her eyes were red and puffy, her hair was a mess, and she was wearing one of my old hoodies. Like that was supposed to make me feel something. "Jake," she whispered, voice trembling. I didn't say anything, just stared. "I know you don't want to talk to me," she continued, twisting her hands together. "But please, just hear me out." I exhaled sharply. "Rachel, there's nothing left to say." "Please," she begged, "just 5 minutes." I should have slammed the door in her face, I should have. But I didn't. I stepped aside, letting her in. She walked in slowly, like she expected me to change my mind and throw her out at any second. I probably should have. Instead, I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "All right, 5 minutes, go." Rachel took a shaky breath. "I know I screwed up. I know I hurt you. And I'm not here to make excuses. I need you to know that I never stopped loving you." I scoffed. "That's rich. You sure had a funny way of showing it." She flinched. "I was scared, Jake. Everything was happening so fast and I panicked. Josh was, I don't know, a stupid mistake, a moment of weakness. But it didn't mean anything." I shook my head. "Rachel, you don't accidentally end up in bed with your ex. That wasn't a moment of weakness. That was a choice." Tears streamed down her face. I know, and I regret it more than anything." I let out a bitter laugh. "You regret it because you got caught." "No," she whispered. "I regret it because I lost you." Silence. I could feel her eyes on me, pleading, waiting for me to say something. But what was there to say? She had ruined us, and I couldn't fix what she broke. Finally, I spoke. "Rachel, I loved you. I would have spent the rest of my life with you, but you threw that away." She let out a choked sob. "Jake, please!" I shook my head. "We're done, Rachel." She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. "I don't know how to live without you." I sighed. That's not my problem anymore. For the first time in weeks, I felt light, because I wasn't carrying her mistakes anymore. Rachel wiped at her tears, looking utterly broken. "So that's it? 7 years just gone?" I clenched my jaw, shoving my hands in my pockets. "You made that decision, not me." She sniffled. "Can we at least stay friends?" I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. Was she serious? "Friends?" I repeated, letting out a dry, humorless laugh. "Rachel, friends don't do what you did." Her face crumpled, and for a split second I felt bad. But then I remembered why we were here in the first place. I walked to the door and held it open. "Goodbye, Rachel." She hesitated for a moment, searching my face for something, anything. But she didn't find what she was looking for. With a defeated sigh, she walked past me out the door. I shut it behind her, and just like that, she was gone. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I took a deep breath and let it all go. No more wedding, no more Rachel, no more bullshit. Just me. And that was enough. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. No wedding plans, no fiancé, no more pretending everything was fine. And honestly, at first it felt like freedom. I slept in without worrying about Rachel calling to nag me about last-minute wedding details. I went out with Ethan and my other friends whenever I wanted. I didn't have to check my phone every 5 minutes, afraid of missing a text from her. For the first time in a long time, I could just breathe. But after a few weeks, the high of my newfound freedom wore off. I wasn't happy, I was just numb. I started avoiding places that reminded me of Rachel. I stopped going to our favorite coffee shop, skipped the bars we used to hang out at, and even took a different route to work so I wouldn't pass by her apartment. I told myself I was moving on, but in reality, I was just running away. At work, I buried myself in projects. I picked up extra shifts, volunteered for late-night assignments, and kept my schedule as packed as possible. Anything to keep my mind from drifting back to her. But no matter how hard I tried, the memories still crept in. Like the way she used to steal my hoodies and act like they were hers, or how she'd randomly text me during the day with some dumb meme just to make me smile, or how for 7 years I had never imagined a future without her. It was stupid. I hated her for what she did. But hate doesn't erase history. And then just as I thought I was finally starting to put the pieces of my life back together, Melissa texted me. "Hey Jake, I know this is random, but can we talk? There's something you need to know." My stomach twisted. Melissa and I hadn't spoken since everything went down, and honestly, I had no desire to. She had covered for Rachel's lies. What could she possibly have to say now? I should have ignored her, but something about the way she worded it. It felt urgent. I hesitated for a minute before replying. "What is it?" She didn't text back. Instead, she called me. I stared at my screen, debating whether to answer. My gut told me nothing good was coming from this conversation. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "Melissa?" She let out a heavy sigh. "Jake, listen, I don't even know how to say this, but Rachel's pregnant." The world tilted. I blinked, trying to process her words. "What?" "She found out a few days ago," Melissa continued. "She didn't know how to tell you, but she thought you should know." My pulse pounded in my ears. "Is it mine?" There was a pause, a long, horrible pause. I don't know," Melissa admitted. "That's why she's freaking out. It could be yours, or it could be Josh's." I closed my eyes, rubbing my temples. Jesus Christ. "I know, Jake, I know. I didn't want you to hear it from someone else." I let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, how thoughtful of her." "Jake!" I hung up before she could say another word. Then I just sat there, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what the hell I was supposed to do next. A baby. There was a baby in this mess now, and I had no idea if it was mine. I didn't sleep that night. My brain wouldn't shut up. I kept picturing all the different scenarios. Scenario 1, the baby was mine. That meant I was going to be tied to Rachel forever. Co-parenting with the woman who betrayed me. Dealing with her lies, her manipulations, her presence in my life for the next 18 years. Scenario 2, the baby was Josh's. That meant I had dodged a bullet, but I'd have to watch Rachel build a family with the guy she cheated on me with. And even though I knew I shouldn't care, it still made me sick to my stomach. There was only one way to find out. The next morning I texted Rachel. "We need to talk, in person." She replied immediately. "Jake, I didn't think you'd want to see me." "I don't, but if there's a chance this baby is mine, I need to know." A few seconds later, my phone lit up again. "Okay, can you come over tonight?" I stared at the message for a long time before finally replying. "Yeah." That was it. No heart emojis, no small talk, just cold, hard reality. That night, I drove to Rachel's apartment, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When she opened the door, she looked different. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was in a messy bun. Her eyes were puffy, like she had been crying. For a second, just a second, I almost felt bad for her. But then I remembered why I was here. I stepped inside, crossing my arms. "Tell me everything." Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. "I found out 3 days ago. I was late, so I took a test. Then I took another one, and another one. She let out a shaky breath. All positive. I inhaled slowly, trying to keep my emotions in check. And you don't know if it's mine. She shook her head. It's too early to tell. I clenched my jaw. Rachel, I need a paternity test, as soon as possible. She nodded quickly. I understand. I'll do whatever you need. I studied her face, searching for any sign of deception, but for once she actually looked genuine. Tired, sad, maybe even ashamed. But I couldn't trust her anymore. I'll set up the test, I said firmly. Until then, don't contact me unless it's about this. Rachel swallowed hard. Okay. I turned to leave, but before I could walk out the door, she whispered, Jake, what if it is yours? I hesitated. Then, without turning around, I said the only thing I knew to be true. Then I'll do what I have to do. And I walked out, leaving everything behind. The next few days were absolute hell. I went to work, went through the motions, but my mind was elsewhere. No matter how hard I tried to focus, all I could think about was that damn paternity test. Rachel had made an appointment for the soonest possible date. It would take 2 weeks to get the results. 2 weeks of waiting, wondering, and questioning everything about my life. I barely slept. Every night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through every possible outcome in my head. What if the baby was mine? Would I be able to co-parent with someone who had betrayed me? Would I have to see Josh at birthday parties, school events, my child's life? Could I ever move past what she had done, knowing our lives would always be connected? And what if the baby wasn't mine? Would that finally give me the closure I needed? Or would it be another knife in my back, knowing Rachel had built a family with the guy she cheated on me with? I was drowning in what-ifs, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. Ethan tried to keep me distracted. He dragged me to bars, made me join a gym with him, even got me back into playing video games. But nothing could take my mind off what was coming. Then finally the results were in. Rachel texted me, I got the call, can you come over? My stomach twisted into knots. I hadn't seen her since everything went down. This was it. I drove over, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. When she opened the door, she looked worse than before. Her skin was pale, her eyes swollen like she hadn't slept in days. For a second I thought, did she already know? She stepped aside, letting me in without a word. I sat down on the couch, my heart pounding in my ears. Well? Rachel took a deep breath. It's not yours. I exhaled so hard it felt like my lungs had been crushed. I didn't know if I wanted to cry or laugh hysterically. It wasn't mine. I wasn't going to be tied to Rachel forever. I didn't have to deal with years of custody battles, awkward holidays, or watching her and Josh raise a kid together. I was free. Rachel wiped at her eyes. Jake, I held up a hand. Don't. She bit her lip. I really thought it was yours. I shook my head. Rachel, I don't care anymore. It's not mine. That means we have nothing left to say to each other. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. Can we at least— No, I said firmly, standing up. I spent 7 years loving you, 7 years believing in us, and you threw it all away. Now, I'm done. She let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth. I get it. I nodded. Good. I turned and walked out that door. And this time I didn't look back. 1 year later, it's crazy how much life can change in a year. After everything with Rachel, I knew I needed a fresh start. So I moved to a new apartment, changed my routine, and threw myself into work. I traveled more, reconnected with old friends, and for the first time in forever, I focused on myself. Rachel tried to reach out a couple more times, but I ignored every message. She made her choices, and I made mine. And the best part, I met someone new. Her name is Lena, and she's nothing like Rachel. She's kind, funny, and, most importantly, honest. From the moment I met her, everything just felt easy. No games, no doubts, just two people who actually cared about each other. One evening, as Lena and I sat on my couch, she turned to me with a curious smile. You ever think about the past? I hesitated, sipping my beer. Sometimes, but not in the way I used to. She raised an eyebrow. And how did you used to think about it? I let out a breath, setting my drink down. Like it was something I had to fix, like I needed answers, closure, something to make it all make sense. And now? I smiled. Now I just feel lucky that it's behind me. She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. I like that. And for the first time in a long time, I meant every word. Final thoughts. Looking back, I realized something. Rachel breaking my heart was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because sometimes the worst heartbreak leads you to the best possible future. I had spent 7 years with someone who didn't truly value me. But that pain pushed me towards something better. Towards someone better. And now, I wouldn't change a damn thing. Because I'm finally exactly where I'm supposed to be. Story 3. My parents skipped my wedding. Because I married before my perfect sister, now their fake family image is falling apart. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. I should have known my parents wouldn't be there for me on my wedding day, just like they hadn't truly been there for me in 100 other ways before. But I had still clung to a small, foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. It wasn't. Growing up, my younger sister, Madison, was the golden child, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately became the center of attention. She wasn't just good at things, she was exceptional. The moment she could walk, she was dazzling crowds in talent shows. By the time we were in elementary school, she was effortlessly winning every spelling bee, science fair, and dance competition she entered. High school only made it worse. She was crowned prom queen, elected class president, and accepted into every prestigious college she applied to. But she had bigger dreams, modeling. And of course, that worked out for her too. Agencies practically fought over her, offering contracts and setting up professional shoots before she had even graduated. My parents treated her like royalty. They were so proud of her that they framed her first professional headshot and hung it above the fireplace like some sacred relic. They would bring up her latest accomplishments at every family gathering, boasting about how their beautiful, talented daughter was going places. And then there was me. I wasn't unsuccessful. I worked hard and built a good life for myself, but I was never enough in their eyes. While Madison was dazzling crowds, I was the quiet kid who loved books and computers. I got good grades, never got in trouble, and eventually earned a degree in computer science, securing a stable, well-paying job as a software developer. But my accomplishments never held the same weight. When Madison landed her first major modeling gig, my parents threw a massive party, inviting family, friends, and even a few of her agency contacts. When I graduated college, they barely acknowledged it. No celebration, no heartfelt congratulations, just a distracted well done before they turned their attention back to Madison's next photo shoot. It wasn't just achievements that set us apart. Even in appearance, my mother constantly reminded me that I was the lesser daughter. Madison was tall, effortlessly slim, with striking features that cameras adored. Meanwhile, I had always been shorter and curvier, a reality my mother seemed to take as a personal disappointment. She signed me up for gym memberships I never wanted, pushed diets on me that I had no interest in, and made backhanded comments about how Madison never had to struggle with her weight. Once, when I was a teenager, she looked me up and down and sighed before saying that if I just put in a little more effort, I could look just as nice as my sister. I never forgot that moment. By my mid-20s, I had given up trying to impress them. I had spent years chasing their approval, joining clubs they recommended, taking classes they encouraged, even trying modeling for a brief, disastrous period that Madison never let me forget. But it had never been enough. So I stopped trying. I focused on building a life that was mine, surrounding myself with people who saw me for who I was, not for what I lacked compared to Madison. Family gatherings became nothing more than a performance. I would sit there, smiling politely while my parents gushed over Madison's latest success, her campaigns, her social media following, her incredible new boyfriend. They never asked about my life. I could have been working on a groundbreaking software project or moving across the country for a dream job, and they wouldn't have cared. And then life threw me a curveball. At a tech conference, I met someone who changed everything. He was kind, intelligent, and most importantly, he saw me. Unlike my parents, who constantly compared me to Madison, he appreciated me exactly as I was. He loved my dry sense of humor, my intelligence, my passion for coding, and he never made me feel like I had to change to be worthy of love. For the first time, I was with someone who made me feel chosen. I thought my parents would be happy for me. I thought they would finally see me. not as Madison's less impressive sister, but as someone who had built her own life on her own terms. I was wrong, because as it turned out, my happiness was an inconvenience. My engagement, my wedding, these things didn't fit into the narrative my parents had carefully built around Madison. She was supposed to be the first to walk down the aisle, the one with the fairy tale wedding, the one who carried on the perfect family legacy. And I had ruined it. I didn't realize it at the time, but my decision to get married before my sister would shake the fragile illusion my parents had spent years crafting. And that was something they would never forgive me for. Falling in love had never been something I actively pursued. It happened unexpectedly in the middle of a technology conference I had nearly skipped. Work had been exhausting, and I had little interest in networking or sitting through industry panels. But if I had chosen to stay home, I never would have met the man who would change everything. He wasn't the kind of person my parents would have been immediately impressed by. No flashy charm, no family connections, no effortless arrogance. Instead, he was steady, thoughtful, and genuinely kind. While others at the conference focused on impressing people, he was simply interested in getting to know me. For the first time, I wasn't being compared to my sister. No one was weighing my value against hers. I was simply seen. What started as friendly conversations over coffee turned into late-night talks, shared meals, and weekends spent together. He appreciated my humor, admired my intelligence, and never once made me feel like I needed to change. He saw me for exactly who I was, and for the first time in my life I felt like I was enough. 4 years later, he proposed. There was no grand spectacle, no dramatic public gesture. It was just the two of us, sitting on the couch with takeout containers on the coffee table and our favorite TV show playing in the background. He looked at me with complete certainty and asked if I would spend my life with him. There was no hesitation in my answer. It was perfect. Telling my parents should have been a joyful moment. I had naively expected excitement, or at the very least, polite support. Instead, I was met with silence. My mother had spoken first, carefully choosing her words. Maybe it would be best to wait a little longer. Marriage was a big step, after all. Then, as if it was an afterthought, she suggested that I might want to focus on improving my appearance before the wedding. My father barely reacted at all. At first, I convinced myself they were just caught off guard, that they needed time to process the news. But I knew better. They weren't upset because they disliked my fiancée. They were upset because I was getting married first. The engagement party only confirmed it. Throughout the evening, my parents remained detached, whispering among themselves rather than engaging with guests. At one point, I noticed them sitting in the corner, hunched over my mother's phone. Later, my fiancé told me what I hadn't been able to hear, that they had been on the phone with Madison, who had been crying. This hadn't been the plan. My parents had always envisioned Madison's wedding first. She was supposed to have the extravagant ceremony, the lavish reception, the picture-perfect love story. My mother had spent years curating Pinterest boards for Madison's future wedding. When it came to mine, she had no interest. Choosing a dress should have been special, a bonding experience. Instead, it had been an afterthought. When I found the perfect gown, an elegant A-line dress that made me feel beautiful, my mother had simply called it practical and moved on. Madison, who wasn't even engaged at the time, had received more enthusiasm for her hypothetical wedding than I did for my actual one. Still, I tried not to let it get to me. I reminded myself that I had my fiancé, my friends, and my soon-to-be in-laws who treated me like family. My future mother-in-law stepped in where my own mother wouldn't. She helped with planning, offered advice, and made sure I felt supported. But my parents' coldness lingered. When the wedding invitations were sent out, both electronically and through physical mail, my fiancé and I double-checked the guest list. The electronic invitations had read receipts. I knew my parents had seen them, and yet they never RSVP'd. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I called, texted, and emailed, asking if they were coming. The responses were vague. They were busy. They needed to check their schedules. They weren't sure. Weeks passed. The wedding grew closer. They weren't coming. It wasn't about scheduling conflicts. It wasn't about needing more time. It was a deliberate decision. Madison wasn't the first to get engaged. She wouldn't be the first to walk down the aisle. And my parents would never forgive me for that. The weeks leading up to the wedding should have been exciting. I should have been focused on finalizing details, choosing the perfect music, and imagining the moment I would walk down the aisle. Instead, a heavy weight settled in my chest, growing heavier with each passing day. My parents' absence hung over everything, an unspoken reminder that no matter how much I had built a life of my own, I would always be the second daughter in their eyes. Madison had always been their priority. That much had been clear my entire life. But a part of me had still believed that when it truly mattered, when I was standing at one of the biggest moments of my life, they would put aside their obsession with image and show up. They didn't. Their absence wasn't just an afterthought, it was deliberate, a statement. It wasn't that they hadn't received an invitation. They had. The read receipts confirmed they had seen it. My texts, calls, and emails had all gone unanswered or deflected with vague responses about checking their schedules. I had spent days pretending I wasn't bothered. I had told myself that I was fine, that I didn't need them there. But the truth was, it hurt. It hurt in a way I couldn't explain. My in-laws, sensing the tension, had done everything they could to make up for it. My future mother-in-law took me dress shopping, helped finalize decorations, and made sure I was surrounded by warmth and love. My fiancé reminded me over and over that I was enough, that this wedding wasn't about proving anything to my parents. It was about us. And still it hurt. The wedding day arrived. The ceremony was held in a beautiful garden, bathed in soft afternoon sunlight. I stood at the altar, looking at the man I loved, feeling the weight of every moment that had led us here. The guests smiled. The air was filled with laughter, and for the most part, it was everything I had hoped for. But there were moments when their absence felt like a physical ache. The empty front row where they should have been sitting. The father-daughter dance I didn't get to have. The whispered questions from distant relatives who hadn't realized until that moment that my parents had chosen not to come. Still, I smiled. I laughed. I let myself be happy. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about them. It was about the people who were there, the friends who had stood by my side, the family I was gaining through marriage, and the man who had loved me enough to choose me even when my own parents hadn't. The honeymoon gave me a brief escape. For a little while, I didn't think about my parents. I didn't wonder if they regretted their decision, if they had even thought about me on my wedding day, if they had felt even the slightest bit of guilt. But when we got back, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed answers. It took several attempts to reach them. When my mother finally picked up, her voice was cool, distant. There was no mention of the wedding, no acknowledgement of the weeks of silence. Instead, she immediately launched into an explanation. How hurt they had been that I hadn't personally handed them a formal invitation. I reminded her that they had received the invitation, both electronic and physical. She denied it. I checked the email records while on the phone. The invitation had been opened. The physical one had been confirmed delivered. Still, she insisted they had never received it. I could have pressed the issue further, could have laid out every shred of proof. But it wouldn't have mattered. This wasn't about an invitation. This was about control, about punishing me for stepping outside the narrative they had carefully built. My father finally spoke, his voice flat and tired. He told me that they had always expected things to happen in a certain order. Madison had been meant to marry first. It wasn't that they didn't care about me, he insisted. It was that they hadn't been prepared for this, as if my wedding had somehow been an inconvenience to them, as if my happiness had been something that disrupted their plans, rather than something to celebrate. I hung up feeling strangely empty. My fiancé, seeing the look on my face, didn't ask what they had said. He already knew. And for the first time, I let go of the hope that they would ever change. The wedding had been everything I had hoped for, almost. The venue had been breathtaking, a garden filled with soft golden light as the sun dipped below the horizon. My dress, the one my mother had dismissed as practical, made me feel more beautiful than I ever had in my life. My friends and my new family surrounded me, their smiles and laughter filling the air with warmth. But the absence of my parents was impossible to ignore. I had tried to prepare myself for it. I had told myself that it didn't matter, that their seats being empty in the front row wasn't going to ruin my day. But when I walked down the aisle, my heart still clenched at the sight of those unfilled spaces. It wasn't just that they weren't there, it was what their absence meant, a choice, a refusal, a reminder that in their eyes I had done something unforgivable. Still, I smiled. I focused on the people who had shown up. My mother-in-law, who had fussed over every tiny detail with me in the weeks leading up to the big day. My father-in-law, who had stepped in when I had admitted, voice shaking, that I didn't have anyone to walk me down the aisle. My friends who had stood by my side and reminded me that family wasn't just about blood. The ceremony was beautiful. My vows were steady. My hands didn't shake. And when my husband looked at me, I knew without a doubt that this was the life I wanted. A life built outside of my parents' expectations. A life where I didn't have to beg for approval. Still, there were moments when I felt the ache of what was missing. During the reception, when the father-daughter dance took place, I stayed in my seat, pretending I wasn't watching. When guests came up to congratulate me and hesitated, glancing at the empty chairs where my parents should have been, I smiled and brushed it off. When a distant aunt finally asked where they were, lowering her voice as if the question itself was inappropriate, I answered simply, they couldn't make it. No one needed to know the truth, but my husband saw through it. Later, when the night was winding down and the last guests were preparing to leave, he found me standing alone by the edge of the garden. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He just took my hand and held it. They weren't going to change. He knew it. I knew it. But knowing it didn't make it hurt any less. After the wedding. Seeking closure. The honeymoon should have been an escape, a brief period where I could forget about everything except the new life my husband and I were building together. And for a while it was. We traveled, explored new cities, laughed over meals at restaurants where no one knew who we were. But reality was waiting when we got back. I had avoided calling my parents for as long as I could. Part of me had wanted to leave it alone, to accept the truth and move on. But another part, one I hated, still wanted answers. I needed to hear them say it. I needed to know why they had made the choice they did. It took several tries before my mother finally answered. She didn't sound embarrassed or apologetic. If anything, she seemed almost irritated, as if my call was an inconvenience. There was no acknowledgement of the wedding, no question about how it had gone. Instead, she jumped straight into explaining how hurt they had been by my actions. They had never received a proper invitation, she claimed. I corrected her immediately. They had. The electronic invite had been opened. The physical one had been delivered and confirmed. She insisted that I must have made a mistake. I reminded her of the emails I had sent, the texts, the phone calls. Still, she brushed it off. The truth was clear. This had never been about an invitation. This had been a punishment, a message. My father eventually spoke, his voice calm but distant. He explained that they had always imagined things unfolding in a certain way. Madison was meant to marry first. My wedding had disrupted something they hadn't been prepared for, as if my happiness had somehow ruined their plans. I had thought hearing them say it out loud would bring some kind of closure. Instead, it left me feeling hollow. They had never intended to come. No matter what I had done, no matter how many times I had reached out, it wouldn't have made a difference. I hung up without arguing. There was nothing left to say. My husband found me sitting on the couch, staring at my phone. He didn't ask what they had said. He already knew. Instead, he sat beside me and took my hand, holding it tightly in his own. And for the first time, I let myself accept it. They had made their choice, and now I had to make mine. The silence from my parents after our last phone call should have been the end of it. I had gotten my answer, even if it wasn't the one I had wanted. They weren't going to apologize. They weren't going to acknowledge what they had done. And they certainly weren't going to change. I told myself I was done, that I had finally let go of that last sliver of hope I had been clinging to for so many years. I had my husband, my friends, my new family. I didn't need their approval anymore. But the past had a way of pulling me back in. At first it was small things. Polite but distant messages from extended relatives. A few awkward phone calls that ended in strained silence whenever the topic of my parents came up. a vague sense that something was happening behind the scenes. Then I found out what it was. Madison had gotten engaged. The moment the news broke, it was as if my wedding had never existed. My parents, who had treated my marriage as an inconvenience, suddenly had an endless supply of energy when it came to planning hers. Every family conversation, every phone call, every event became about Madison's upcoming wedding. It wasn't just that they were excited for her. They were making a point. Where my engagement had been ignored, hers was celebrated. Where my wedding had been treated like an afterthought, hers was being planned with meticulous care. My mother, who hadn't lifted a finger to help me, was suddenly taking Madison to exclusive dress fittings, helping her select a venue, and bragging to relatives about how it was going to be the event of the year. At first, I ignored it. I reminded myself that this wasn't about me. It was about Madison, about their need to uphold the perfect image of their golden child. But as time passed, the more I tried to distance myself, the harder they pushed. Family members started reaching out, some subtly, others more direct. They told me that I should be there for my sister, that no matter what had happened, family is family. Some even implied that Madison had supported me during my wedding, so it was only fair that I return the favor. That part almost made me laugh. Madison hadn't acknowledged my wedding. She hadn't sent a message, hadn't called, hadn't even pretended to care. And yet I was now expected to set everything aside, show up, and celebrate her happiness while my parents paraded her around as the daughter who had done things the right way. The pressure only increased. My mother finally reached out, acting as if nothing had happened, casually slipping Madison's wedding into the conversation. She hoped I wouldn't let past misunderstandings get in the way of the family coming together for such an important event. It was surreal. She hadn't attended my wedding. She hadn't called, hadn't asked how it went, hadn't even tried to pretend that she cared. But now she expected me to show up for Madison, to play the role of the supportive sister, to fall back into line and pretend none of it had happened. I took a deep breath before responding. I wouldn't be attending. She went quiet for a moment. Then the polite facade cracked. The disappointment in her voice was unmistakable, quickly giving way to something harsher. She accused me of trying to sabotage Madison's happiness, of being bitter and jealous, of causing unnecessary division in the family. She spoke as if I was the one destroying relationships, as if I was the one being unreasonable. I let her speak. I didn't argue, didn't try to defend myself, didn't waste my energy on explanations she would never accept. When she finally stopped, I told her one simple thing. She had made her choice, and now I was making mine. I ended the call before she could respond. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty about it. But my parents weren't done with their damage control. In the days that followed, more relatives reached out, trying to persuade me to change my mind. Some disguised their words as concern, saying they didn't want me to have regrets later. Others were more direct, accusing me of being petty, of holding on to grudges that should have been left in the past. But the most absurd message came from Madison herself. She sent me a carefully worded email, the kind of thing she had always excelled at, polite on the surface but dripping with condescension underneath. She started by saying she was disappointed in me, that I was letting my emotions cloud my judgment. She reminded me of everything our parents had done for us over the years, how they had given us everything. Then she got to the real point. She understood that my wedding hadn't been exactly what I had envisioned, but that didn't mean I had to ruin hers in retaliation. As if my refusal to attend had anything to do with revenge. As if I was the one making things a competition. I read the email twice, then without responding I blocked her. Madison had never liked being ignored. I knew that would drive her crazy. But for the first time, I didn't care. I was done playing their games. I was done trying to fit into a family that had never made space for me. Blocking Madison should have been the end of it. I had made my decision, set my boundary, and refused to be pulled back into their manipulative games. But, as expected, she wasn't one to let things go quietly. A few days after I cut off contact, my husband found me sitting on the couch, staring at my phone, shaking my head in disbelief. Madison had found another way to get to me, through him. She had tracked down his number, likely through a mutual acquaintance, and sent him a series of messages that were almost laughable in their self-importance. She had started off formally, addressing him as Rebecca's husband, as if she were drafting a business email instead of texting a family member. She explained that she was deeply concerned about my behavior, that I was making emotional decisions I would surely regret, and that as my partner, he should be the one to help me see reason. The messages became more manipulative as they went on. She claimed that family dynamics were complicated, that someone with my sensitivity might not fully understand the bigger picture. But then came the part that made my husband laugh out loud, the moment where she dropped any pretense of concern and revealed what she really wanted. She suggested that maintaining a good relationship with successful family members like herself would be beneficial for our future. She hinted that he should encourage me to make amends, because burning bridges could have consequences. She had spent her entire life using our parents' favoritism as a weapon, and now she thought she could use it against my husband. He had simply replied with one sentence, "Thank you for your concern, but Rebecca's happiness is my priority. If you have further concerns, you can address them with her directly." She hadn't responded. That night, as we sat on the porch, my husband scrolled through Madison's messages one last time before setting his phone down with a shake of his head. He said it was incredible how much effort she put into keeping up the illusion of perfection. All the careful phrasing, the manipulation, the attempt to make her position sound reasonable, it was exhausting just to read. I told him that she had always been like this. Different decade, same strategy. When we were younger, if she couldn't get to me directly, she would try to turn my friends against me. This was just a more sophisticated version of the same thing. But the difference was I no longer cared. Madison's messages, my mother's disappointment, the pressure from relatives, it had all become noise. I wasn't a teenager anymore, desperate for scraps of validation. I wasn't a young woman trying to fit into a family that had never truly made space for me. I had spent years chasing after something I was never going to get, and now I finally understood that I didn't need it. As the months passed, Madison's wedding planning continued in full force. My parents threw themselves into it with a level of enthusiasm I had never witnessed before. But something interesting started happening. Some of the extended family, the ones who had quietly noticed my parents' favoritism over the years, began speaking up. A few aunts and uncles reached out to me privately, saying they had no idea how bad things had gotten. Some even told me they had no intention of attending Madison's wedding. Apparently, the way my parents had treated me had become a topic of conversation. My absence from the wedding was noticeable, and the explanation my parents had tried to give, that I was being difficult, that I had refused to attend out of jealousy, wasn't convincing enough. The more they tried to control the narrative, the more cracks began to show. I never asked anyone to take my side. I never tried to turn people against them. I simply told the truth, and for once the truth was enough. My parents reached out one last time, accusing me of damaging the family's reputation. They insisted I was spreading false stories about them, that people were refusing to support Madison because of me. But I wasn't the one ruining their image. They had done that all on their own. I didn't respond. Instead, I sat with my husband on our back porch, looking out at the sunset, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: peace. For so long, I had believed that if I just tried harder, if I just proved myself enough, I could make them see me. But they had seen me all along. They had just never wanted me to be anything other than a supporting character in Madison's story. I wasn't going to play that role anymore. I had my own life now, a life where I was enough, exactly as I was. And that was the only happy ending I needed. Story 4. My wife chose to believe her toxic best friend's lies. Instead of me, it destroyed our marriage until the truth was revealed. Looking back, the warning signs had always been there. Love has a way of blinding you, making you believe that things will work out, that people will change. But some people don't change. They just get better at hiding their true nature. When Emma and I met, everything clicked. She had this warmth, this way of making even the most ordinary moments feel special. It didn't take long before we moved in together, and a couple of years later I proposed. It felt right. It felt like the next step in a future we were both excited about, But there was always a third presence in our relationship, someone who never quite let go of her grip on Emma, Stacy. From the first time I met her, something felt off. She carried herself like she owned every room she walked into, always demanding attention, always steering the conversation. The way she looked at me, it wasn't curiosity or friendliness. It was like she was assessing me, waiting for me to slip up, to give her something she could use. Emma and Stacy had been inseparable since college. The kind of friendship built on years of late-night talks, drunken confessions, and being each other's safety net. Emma always spoke about how Stacy had been there through heartbreaks, through family struggles, through every moment of doubt. It was clear she felt a debt to Stacy, a kind of loyalty that overrode reason. At first, I tried to play along. It was important to Emma, so I wanted to respect that. But the longer I was around Stacy, the clearer it became that she didn't see me as Emma's partner. She saw me as competition. The little remarks, the exaggerated sighs when I joined them for dinner, the way she made plans for Emma without ever acknowledging me. Every time I brought it up, Emma brushed it aside, saying Stacy just had a strong personality, that she didn't mean any harm. The signs only became clearer when we moved in together. What should have been an exciting new chapter for us felt like a test, one where Stacy kept finding new ways to wedge herself into our space. She had no problem showing up unannounced, sprawling on our couch like she had every right to be there. If I made dinner for Emma and me, Stacy conveniently dropped by, complaining about how hungry she was, how she'd had a long day, how Emma would never let her starve. One night after Stacy left, I finally brought it up, asking if maybe we could have more nights that were just for us. Emma stiffened, her arms crossing in a way that told me she had already made up her mind. She didn't see a problem. Stacy had been in her life for years, long before me, and she wasn't going to push her aside just because I felt uncomfortable. It wasn't just about spending time together. It was about boundaries, boundaries Stacy refused to respect. She had no issue rummaging through our fridge, making herself at home, offering unsolicited advice on everything from our grocery choices to the way we decorated. One time, she held up a bottle of dressing and scoffed, saying she expected Emma to eat healthier now that they were sharing a space. I laughed it off, but it stuck with me. She was testing her limits, seeing what she could get away with. The worst part was that Emma always excused it. If I pointed out how Stacy seemed to be everywhere, Emma just sighed, saying Stacy was going through a tough time, that she didn't have many other friends, that she just needed support. It was a cycle. Stacy overstepped. I voiced concern. Emma defended her, over and over again. It didn't stop there. Every milestone in our relationship came with resistance from Stacy. When we planned a weekend getaway, Emma hesitated at the last minute, saying Stacy had just gone through a breakup and didn't want to be alone. The idea of canceling flickered in her eyes, but I put my foot down that time. We went, but I could tell Emma felt guilty, checking her phone constantly, reading texts from Stacy about how miserable she was, how she wished she had what Emma and I had. That was the first time I truly felt like I was losing. Stacy knew exactly how to play the game. She never outright told Emma I was a problem. Instead, she planted seeds, made little comments about how fast everything was moving, about how Emma never used to miss their Friday night hangouts, about how relationships could change people in ways they didn't realize. Slowly, quietly, she turned what should have been a happy time into something that felt like a tug of war. Emma never saw it. Or maybe she did, but she didn't want to admit it. When I finally said that Stacy needed to give us space, that this wasn't normal, that no healthy relationship had a third person dictating its terms, Emma's face darkened. She told me Stacy wasn't dictating anything, that she was just a concerned friend looking out for her. The way she said it, the way she looked at me, it wasn't anger. It was doubt. A crack forming in something I thought was solid. And Stacy? She saw it too. I could tell by the way she smiled the next time she visited, by the way she looked at me like she knew she'd won something I didn't even realize was a battle. I should have walked away then, but I didn't. I still believed I could fix it. That was my biggest mistake. Proposing to Emma had been one of the easiest decisions of my life. The way she looked at me when I asked, the way she practically tackled me in excitement, it had felt right. Perfect, even. But perfection doesn't last when someone else is determined to ruin it. Stacy had been quick to insert herself into every aspect of our wedding planning. It started small, little suggestions here and there, things I brushed off because I wanted Emma to be happy. The color scheme wasn't good enough, the catering needed more options, the venue was too traditional. At first it seemed like harmless input, like she was just trying to help. But then the demand started. She wanted a special moment during the ceremony, ahead of the bridesmaids. Her reasoning? She had been there through every one of Emma's breakups, every heartbreak, every struggle. The wedding wasn't just about celebrating love. It was about celebrating the people who had supported Emma along the way. I had thought it was a joke at first. No one seriously asks to have their own walk down the aisle at someone else's wedding, right? But Emma hesitated when I pushed back. She wasn't thrilled with the idea, but she didn't want to fight Stacy on it. She kept saying it was just a small thing, not worth the drama. That was when I realized something. Emma wasn't in control. On our wedding day, Stacy strutted down the aisle like she was the star of the show. The way she held her head high, the smirk she shot in my direction, the satisfied little glance she gave Emma. I could see it all so clearly now. She wasn't just a friend celebrating with us. She was staking her claim. My parents exchanged awkward glances. My best man whispered a stunned, "What the hell?" under his breath. But I just smiled for the photos. What else could I do? This was Emma's best friend, and if I made a scene, I'd be the villain. So I let it go. I thought things would get better once we were married, that Stacy would step back now that Emma and I had officially started our life together. But I underestimated her. If anything, she got worse. It was little things at first. When Emma and I made plans, Stacy always seemed to be included. If I suggested a date night, Emma would suddenly remember that she had promised Stacy they'd do something together. If I brought up a restaurant I wanted to try, Stacy had already recommended another one, and Emma thought we should give it a shot. It was like we couldn't make a single decision without her input. I tried to be patient. I didn't want to be that guy, the husband who isolates his wife from her friends. So I kept my mouth shut longer than I should have. But patience only goes so far. One night, after yet another weekend where Stacy had inserted herself into our plans, I finally said something. Told Emma it felt like we were never alone, that maybe it was time to set some boundaries. She had looked at me like I'd suggested cutting off a limb. Stacy had been her best friend for over a decade. She didn't understand why this was such a big deal to me. She even accused me of not understanding how much Stacy had done for her. That was when I knew. Emma wasn't just defending Stacy, she was justifying her dependence on her. I could have pushed harder. Maybe I should have. But I told myself it wasn't worth another argument. I convinced myself that Emma would see it eventually, that one day she'd realize just how much control Stacy had over her life. I didn't know then that I was already losing her. The final straw came a year into our marriage on what should have been a quiet Friday night. I was in the kitchen, chopping onions for tacos, looking forward to a simple evening at home. Then the doorbell rang. Emma answered it, and within seconds I heard Stacy's wailing. I stepped into the living room just in time to see her clinging to Emma like she was drowning. Mascara streaked down her face. A duffel bag hung off her shoulder, and she sobbed about how he had left her, how she had nowhere to go. I didn't need to ask who he was. She collapsed onto our couch, rambling about how blindsided she was, how she had done everything for him, how she didn't deserve this. Emma held her hand, nodding along sympathetically, while I stood there, knife still in hand, wondering how this had suddenly become my problem. It didn't take long before Emma asked if Stacy could stay with us for a few days, just until she got back on her feet. I could already see where this was going. I wanted to say no. I should have said no. But I knew how it would look, turning away Emma's devastated best friend while she was in tears. So I forced a smile and said it was fine. At first I told myself it was temporary, a few days, maybe a week. But Stacy had never been good at boundaries. She took over the guest room, turning it into a disaster zone. Clothes scattered everywhere, dirty dishes piling up, random shopping bags shoved into corners. It was like a teenager had moved in. The living room wasn't safe either. She stretched out on the couch, binge-watching reality shows at full volume, snacks spread across the coffee table. Twice I came home from work to find her still in her pajamas, eating straight out of a family-sized chip bag like she had no plans to move anytime soon. She wasn't staying with us. She was living with us. I tried to bring it up gently, reminding Emma that Stacy had been here for over 2 weeks now. Emma looked torn, but she told me Stacy just needed a little more time. I repeated her words back to myself every time I walked into the kitchen and found a sink full of unwashed dishes. Every time I had to step over another pile of Stacy's things in the hallway. Every time she made some offhand remark about how different Emma seemed since getting married. One night I'd finally had enough. I told Emma it was time for Stacy to go. She wasn't just staying with us, she was taking over. Emma hesitated but agreed to talk to her. The conversation didn't go well. Stacy played the victim effortlessly, her eyes welling up with tears as she gasped that she never realized she was such a burden, that she didn't mean to be in the way. Emma rushed to reassure her, saying it wasn't like that we just wanted to make sure she was okay. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling like I was fighting a battle I'd already lost. It took another week before Stacy finally left. When she packed up her things and walked out the door, she shot me a look, one that sent a chill through me, a look that said, "This isn't over." And I believed her. The house felt lighter after Stacy left. For the first time in weeks, I could sit in my own living room without hearing reality TV blaring or stepping over someone else's mess. I thought maybe, just maybe, things would start going back to normal. But if there was one thing I had learned, it was that Stacy never truly left. At first, it was little things. Emma would get texts at all hours, her phone lighting up constantly with Stacy's dramatic updates. How she was struggling, how she felt so alone, how hard it was to start over. Emma ate it up, comforting her, reassuring her, making plans to check in on her. Every conversation we had somehow circled back to Stacy. If I asked Emma how her day was, she'd sigh and say something about how Stacy was barely holding it together. If I suggested a date night, she'd pause, thinking about whether Stacy needed her. It was exhausting. I told myself to be patient. This was just a rough patch, a transition. Eventually, Stacy would move on, find someone else to cling to. I was wrong. A month after she left, I came home from work and found Emma sitting at the kitchen table looking nervous. She wasn't just nervous, she looked guilty. The way she fiddled with her fingers, how she avoided my eyes, it set off alarms before she even opened her mouth. She wanted to talk. Stacy was having trouble adjusting. The apartment she moved into was too expensive, and she was struggling with bills. She had tried looking for a roommate, but nothing was working out. She didn't know what to do. And then, almost as if the idea had just occurred to her, Emma suggested that maybe, just maybe, Stacy could stay with us again, just temporarily, just until she got back on her feet. I felt my jaw tighten. The last time she stayed, it had been weeks before we could get her out. She had turned our house into her personal crash pad. She had walked around like she belonged there. And now, she wanted back in. I told Emma no, this time I wasn't budging. Emma looked genuinely upset, like she couldn't believe I was saying no. Stacy was her best friend, and best friends didn't abandon each other. How could I be so heartless? How could I turn my back on someone who had been there for her through everything? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just about Stacy anymore. This was about Emma, about the fact that she cared more about Stacy's comfort than about my boundaries, my sanity. For the first time since getting married, I wondered if we had made a mistake. That night, things were tense. Emma barely spoke to me, her silence heavy, like she was punishing me for saying no. The next few days were no better. Every time she looked at her phone, I could tell she was talking to Stacy. Whispered calls, long text messages, her mood shifting from frustration to guilt to something close to resentment. I could feel her slipping away. A week later, I came home and immediately knew something was wrong. The house was too quiet. Emma was sitting on the couch, her hands clenched together in her lap, her eyes red like she had been crying. She had made a decision. She told me Stacy had nowhere else to go, that she had already told her she could move in, that she needed to be there for her. It wasn't a request. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Emma had made the choice without me. She had invited Stacy back into our home like my opinion didn't matter. I told her if Stacy moved in, I wouldn't stay. Emma looked at me like I had slapped her. She told me I was being unfair, that I was making her choose between me and her best friend. But that was the thing. I wasn't the one making her choose. Stacy had done that the moment she turned our marriage into a battleground. The silence stretched between us. I saw it in Emma's face then. The conflict, the hesitation, the moment where she could have pulled back, could have realized what she was doing. But then her phone buzzed, and I knew. She had already chosen. I walked out. I spent the night at a hotel, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. I had fought so hard for this marriage, for Emma, for us, but it had never been a fair fight. Stacy had been there from the beginning, a constant force pulling at Emma, reshaping our relationship into something that was never just ours. The next morning I sent Emma a text. I told her I wasn't coming back. A few hours later she responded. She thought it was best if we took some time apart. That was it. No fight, no attempt to fix things, just a quiet confirmation of what I had already known. She had made her choice, and for the first time in a long time I finally made mine. Update 1. The lie that broke everything. 2 months passed. 2 long, exhausting months where I tried to rebuild my life while Emma played house with Stacy. I moved into an apartment across town, took back control of my space, and tried to focus on work, on friends, on anything that wasn't the wreckage of my marriage. Emma and I barely spoke. The divorce was inevitable, but neither of us had started the paperwork. Maybe she was waiting for me to come crawling back. Maybe she thought time would change my mind. It wouldn't. Then one day, out of nowhere, she texted me. She wanted to talk. I hesitated before agreeing. We met at a coffee shop, and the moment I saw her, I knew something was wrong. She looked wrecked, like she hadn't been sleeping, her usual confidence stripped away. She had found out the truth. Stacy had lied. One of their mutual friends had come forward, someone who had been close to Stacy for years. She had shown Emma messages, proof that Stacy had deliberately sabotaged our marriage. She had never needed a place to stay. She had never been struggling. She had manipulated Emma, played on her emotions, pushed her into choosing her over me. Emma sat across from me, her voice barely above a whisper as she told me everything. The way Stacy had bragged about how easy it had been, how she had made up lies about me to turn Emma against me, how she had even said, I did her a favor. She would have been miserable married to him. Emma was crying now, her hands shaking as she apologized. She told me she had been blind, that she had let Stacy control her, that she had ruined everything. She wanted to fix it. She wanted us back. I let her words sink in. For a long time, I had dreamed of this moment, the moment she would realize what she had done, the moment she would see the truth. But now that it was here, I felt nothing. She had believed Stacy so easily. She had thrown away our marriage without hesitation, and now that she had lost everything, now she wanted to come back. I looked at her, really looked at her. Then I told her no. I got up and walked away. I never looked back. Emma didn't take my rejection well. At first, she sat there in stunned silence, staring at me like she couldn't believe what I had just said. Then the tears started again, slow at first, then shaking sobs that made her shoulders heave. But it didn't change anything. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I just felt done. The moment she had chosen Stacy over me, our marriage had ended. This conversation was just a formality. She tried to reason with me, saying she had been manipulated, that she hadn't realized what Stacy was doing. She begged for another chance, saying she would cut Stacy off, go to therapy, do whatever it took. But the problem wasn't just Stacy. It was the fact that she had been so willing to believe the worst about me, that she had never once stopped to question if maybe, just maybe, I had been telling the truth all along. That wasn't something I could fix. That wasn't something I even wanted to fix. I told her I'd send over the divorce papers. Then I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her sitting there crying into her hands. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next few weeks, Emma sent text after text, long messages filled with apologies, explanations, desperate pleas for me to reconsider. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Then she started showing up at my apartment. The first time, she knocked softly, waiting, hoping I would let her in. I didn't. After a few minutes, she left. The second time, she pounded on the door, her voice shaking as she begged me to talk to her. I still didn't open it. I had already spent too much of my life trying to convince her to trust me. I wasn't about to waste another second. Word spread quickly about what had happened. Our mutual friends, the ones who had distanced themselves when Stacy's lies had first taken hold, started reaching out. They wanted to apologize, to make amends, to say they had been wrong. I ignored most of them. People love a good redemption story, but I wasn't interested in giving them one. If they had been so quick to believe Stacy's version of events, then they weren't people I needed in my life. But Stacy? She wasn't done. Now that Emma had cut her off, Stacy had turned her anger on me. She started spreading new rumors, saying I had manipulated Emma into leaving her, that I had brainwashed her, that I was the real problem all along. She went on social media rants about betrayal, about fake people, about how some men just couldn't handle a strong woman like her. She was unraveling. At first I ignored it, but then one day I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was her job. Someone, one of her co-workers maybe, had forwarded Stacy's unhinged social media posts to her boss. The things she had said, the way she had publicly trashed not just me, but several other people in her life, had finally caught up to her. She had been fired. I should have felt bad, but I didn't. Somewhere, deep down, I think she had always believed she was untouchable, that she could manipulate, destroy, and control without consequences, that people would always take her side. But people like Stacy always push too far. Eventually, they dig their own graves. Emma, on the other hand, was still trying to rebuild her life. She had moved back in with her parents after everything fell apart. From what I heard, her mother was furious with her, constantly reminding her of how easily she had thrown away her marriage. Friends were distant, wary of getting too close to her after seeing how quickly she had turned on me. She was alone, and I wish I could say that gave me some kind of satisfaction. But the truth was, I just didn't care anymore. I had wasted too much time looking backward. It was time to move forward. Update 2. The truth comes out. Months passed. I built a new routine, a life without the constant weight of someone else's judgment. It was strange at first, coming home to a quiet apartment, making plans without having to check in with someone else, but I liked it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own life. Then one evening I ran into Marissa again. She was the one who had first come forward with proof of Stacy's lies, the one who had sent me those damning screenshots that had finally made Emma see the truth. We were both waiting in line at a coffee shop when she spotted me. She hesitated for a second, then smiled. She asked if I had heard the latest. I hadn't. Apparently, Emma had tried to reach out to Stacy, hoping to make amends. I nearly laughed at that. After everything that had happened, after all the ways Stacy had destroyed her life, Emma still wanted to fix things. Marissa nodded, looking just as baffled as I felt. But it hadn't gone the way Emma expected. Instead of an apology, Stacy had laughed in her face. She had called Emma pathetic, told her she was better off without her, and then, just to twist the knife, she had mocked her for losing her marriage over something so stupid. Emma had walked away in tears. That was the moment it finally sank in for her. She had destroyed everything for someone who had never cared about her in the first place. Marissa shook her head, saying she didn't know what was more pathetic. Emma still trying to make peace with Stacy, or the fact that Stacy had moved on without a second thought. I just shrugged. It didn't matter to me anymore. I had spent so much time waiting for justice, for karma, for something to come along and make things right. But now that it had finally happened, I realized I didn't need any of it. Emma and Stacy had ruined their own lives, and I was free. The weight was gone. That was the first thing I noticed in the months that followed. I had spent so much time fighting battles I never should have been in, trying to prove my worth to someone who had never truly valued it. But now, without the constant stress of Stacy's manipulation or Emma's indecision, life felt lighter. The divorce went through without much of a fight. Emma didn't contest anything. She signed the papers quickly, almost as if she was too ashamed to drag things out. She sent a final message after everything was settled, a long-winded apology about how she had let the wrong person influence her, how she wished she had seen things sooner, how she still loved me in some way. I didn't respond, not because I hated her, not because I wanted revenge, but because there was nothing left to say. She had made her choices. I had made mine. And at the end of it all, I didn't owe her closure. The people who had turned their backs on me during the fallout made half-hearted attempts to reconnect. Mutual friends, acquaintances, even a few of her family members who had once looked at me with judgment in their eyes were now awkwardly reaching out. Some apologized outright, saying they had been fooled just like Emma had. Others acted like nothing had happened, like they had never doubted me in the first place. I kept my circle small. The friends who had stuck by me, the ones who hadn't believed Stacy's lies from the start, those were the people I held on to. The rest? They had already shown me how easily they could be swayed. I had no interest in rebuilding bridges that never should have burned in the first place. Stacy, on the other hand, had officially become a social pariah. Her job was gone, her reputation ruined, and from what I heard, even the people who used to laugh at her drama were done with her. She had built her life on control, on manipulation, on making sure she was always the one pulling the strings. But people like that never last forever. Eventually they burn every bridge, push too far, and find themselves completely alone. Emma had tried to move on, but from what little I knew, it wasn't going well. She had tried dating again, but her trust issues had made things complicated. Every time she started to get close to someone, she would pull back, terrified of making the same mistake. I couldn't bring myself to care. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was just done. And being done? That was the best feeling in the world. Conclusion: the best revenge. One day, months later, I was sitting at a cafe, flipping through my phone, when a message popped up from an unknown number. It was Emma. She said she just wanted to check in to see how I was doing. I stared at the message for a long time, wondering what she was really looking for. Maybe she was hoping for another chance, some kind of reconciliation. Maybe she just wanted to ease her guilt. I never responded. Some people spend their whole lives chasing closure, thinking they need that final conversation, that last apology, that one thing to make sense of everything. I didn't. I had already won. Not in a petty, vengeful way. Not because I wanted Emma or Stacy to suffer. I won because I walked away. Because I didn't let their mistakes define me. Because I built a life that was mine, free of manipulation, free of doubt, free of people who only saw me as an afterthought. And as I sat there, drinking my coffee, breathing in the crisp morning air, I realized something. The best revenge wasn't anger. It was happiness. And I had never been happier. Story 5. My wife left for a month with the hot new neighbor. I filed for divorce. She regretted it, but I'm not her second choice. I guess I just need to get this out of my system. My name's Mike. I'm 31. And for a long time I thought I had my life figured out. Nothing flashy. Nothing crazy, just a regular guy with a steady job, a decent house, and what I believed was a solid marriage. Laura and I had been together for almost 8 years. When I think back to the day we met, it feels like a lifetime ago. I was 23, fresh out of college, working my first real job, and still figuring out what adulthood even meant. Laura was 22, trying to find her way in the marketing world. We met at a friend's backyard barbecue. One of those casual get-togethers where everyone drinks cheap beer from red cups and someone always burns the burgers. She walked up to me, smirking, and said, "You look like you're plotting your escape." I don't remember what I said back, but I do remember that she laughed. And just like that, we talked the entire evening. Everything after that moved fast. We started dating, and she brought excitement into my otherwise predictable life. Laura was spontaneous, the type to drag me on random road trips or insist we try that new hole-in-the-wall restaurant that popped up overnight. Meanwhile, I was the practical one, the guy who checked the budget, planned the routes, and made sure we had enough gas before hitting the road. It worked. Or at least I thought it did. 3 years in, we got married. Nothing extravagant. Just a small ceremony with family and close friends. We weren't rich, so there were no grand ballrooms or fancy honeymoon destinations, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that we had each other. Or so I believed. We bought a little 2-bedroom house in a quiet suburb. Not the biggest place, but it was ours. I worked as a software developer, and Laura eventually decided to become a stay-at-home wife. She said she wanted to figure out what she truly wanted in life, and I supported her. Looking back, maybe I got too comfortable. It's easy to fall into a routine when things seem stable. Work, home, occasional date nights, rinse and repeat. I stopped noticing the little things, like how much Laura thrived on attention. She had a way of lighting up a room, drawing people in effortlessly. I guess over time, I started assuming that energy was something permanent between us, not something that needed to be nurtured. I should have paid more attention. Then Jake moved in. Jake was our new next-door neighbor, and from the moment he arrived, he turned heads. He was about 28, younger than most people in our neighborhood. A personal trainer, confident, and if I'm being honest, way too good-looking for his own good. He had the kind of physique that made people do a double take, like he had just stepped out of a fitness magazine. And he made sure people noticed. Always outside, washing his car, mowing the lawn, setting up a pull-up bar in his yard. There was always a reason for him to be shirtless. Laura noticed him immediately. How could she not? The first time we met Jake, he had walked over to introduce himself. It was a Saturday morning, and Laura and I were in the front yard pulling weeds. He strolled up, flashed a perfect smile, and said, "Hey, I'm Jake. Just moved in next door." Laura practically lit up. She started asking him questions. Where he was from, what he did, how he liked the neighborhood. I stood there nodding along, barely getting a word in. The two of them chatted like old friends. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Laura was friendly, outgoing. It was just her nature. But then the little things started happening. She'd casually mentioned seeing Jake outside when I got home from work. Then it turned into her spending more time in the front yard, conveniently whenever Jake was out there. At first, I brushed it off. But then there was the gym. Laura suddenly got really into fitness. She had never been the type to care about working out before. But now she was at the gym almost every day. And guess who worked as a personal trainer at that exact gym? I told myself I was overthinking it. But deep down, I could feel something shifting. The thing about cracks in a relationship is that they don't show up all at once. They start small, almost invisible. But if you ignore them, they spread. And before you know it, everything you thought was solid starts to crumble. One evening I came home to find Laura in the kitchen, humming to herself as she chopped vegetables. There was an energy about her that I hadn't seen in a long time. She was glowing. "Good day?" I asked, setting my bag down. She turned to me, smiling. "Yeah, I had a great workout. Jake pushed me really hard today." That was the first time she had said his name so casually, as if he had become a normal part of our daily conversations. I nodded, not wanting to overreact. "That's good. You should come sometime," she said, stirring the pan. "He's really great at what he does." I didn't know how to respond to that. A part of me wanted to say, "Why are you suddenly so interested in fitness?" But I bit my tongue. I didn't want to be the insecure husband. Still, something about the way she spoke about him left an uneasy feeling in my chest. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the thought. Was I just being paranoid, or was something actually happening? I had no idea that this was just the beginning. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Marriages go through phases, right? People find new hobbies, and sometimes they get excited about them. Maybe this was just Laura's way of adding something fresh to her life. But it wasn't just the gym. It was the way she talked about Jake, the way she started dressing differently, leggings, fitted tops, new sports bras, like she suddenly cared about looking good at the gym. It was the way she kept her phone angled away from me when she texted, smirking at whatever was on the screen. And then the late night started. At first, it was her staying after workouts to chat with the girls. Then it turned into her grabbing smoothies or sitting in the sauna. I didn't question it much at first. But then, one night, she didn't come home until nearly 11. She walked in, breathless, hair damp like she had just showered. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down like nothing was wrong. I glanced at the clock. "You were at the gym this whole time?" She hesitated for a second. "Yeah, I lost track of time." I frowned. "Your gym closes at 10. Her lips parted slightly, but she recovered fast. "Yeah, I know. A few of us grabbed smoothies after." She gave me a look like I was overreacting. "You don't mind, do you?" I forced a smile. "No, of course not." But something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. The next time she came home late, I asked casually who she had been hanging out with. She rattled off a few names, none of which I had ever heard her mention before. I started paying attention. One evening I left work early and drove by the gym just to see if she was actually there. Her car was parked outside, so I sat there for a while waiting, feeling ridiculous. Maybe she really was just working out. Then I saw him. Jake walked out first, followed by Laura. They were laughing about something, her hand resting on his arm before she pulled away. He leaned in to say something, and she smiled, this warm, genuine smile I hadn't seen in a long time. She didn't check her phone, which meant she wasn't planning to text me that she was done yet. I gripped the steering wheel. I could have confronted her right then and there, but I didn't. I wanted to see how far she would take this, so I went home and waited. She walked in 2 hours later. "Hey, babe," she called from the hallway. "I'm starving. You eat already?" I stayed seated on the couch, pretending to scroll through my phone. "Yeah," I said casually. "How was your workout?" She came into the living room, stretching her arms like she was exhausted. "Good. Tough, but good." That was it. No mention of Jake. No mention of staying after. I nodded, keeping my voice even. "That's great." She walked into the kitchen, humming to herself. Like nothing had happened. A few days later, I tested something. I asked her if she wanted to go on a weekend trip. Just the two of us. A little getaway, something we hadn't done in a while. She hesitated. "Maybe another time," she said. "I've got a lot going on right now." I laughed a little. "Laura, you don't have a job. What's keeping you so busy?" Her eyes flashed. "Excuse me?" I held my hands up. "I didn't mean it like that. I just meant we haven't spent much time together lately." She softened slightly, but she still seemed reluctant. "I know. I've just been in a good groove at the gym, you know?" I nodded but didn't press further. Later that night, I woke up in the middle of the night and reached for her, but her side of the bed was empty. I got up and walked through the house, checking the bathroom, the kitchen. Then I saw the faint glow from the living room. She was curled up on the couch, her phone in her hand, the light illuminating her face. She didn't hear me at first. "Everything okay?" I asked. She startled, locking her phone in one quick motion. "Yeah, fine, just couldn't sleep." I stared at her. "Who were you texting?" She shrugged. "Just some friends from the gym." Something about the way she said it put me on edge. The next day, I decided I needed to be sure. On my lunch break, I drove to her gym and walked inside. I had no real plan, just an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I spotted one of the front desk staff, a woman I had seen before when Laura first signed up. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone light. "My wife comes here all the time. Laura?" She smiled. "Oh yeah, Laura, she's been making great progress." I nodded. "Yeah, she loves it. I was just wondering, does she usually work out alone?" The woman hesitated, glancing away. "Well, she trains with Jake a lot." "Right, just training?" She let out a small laugh. "I mean, you know how it is. Everyone talks, flirts a little. It's a gym." "Flirts?" I forced a smile. "Of course, thanks." I walked out, my stomach twisting. That night when Laura came home, I decided to test her one last time. "You and Jake seem pretty close," I said casually as we ate dinner. She didn't even blink. "Yeah, he's a great trainer." That was the moment I knew she was lying to me. At this point, I wasn't looking for proof anymore. I already knew. I was just waiting for the moment she'd slip up, the moment she'd stop covering her tracks so well. And that moment came sooner than I expected. One Friday night, Laura told me she was going to a gym group dinner. Nothing fancy, just some people from her workout crew grabbing a meal together. I acted normal, told her to have fun, and even joked that she shouldn't let them rope her into ordering kale smoothies instead of real food. She laughed and kissed my cheek before heading out. An hour later, I decided to check. Not because I wanted to catch her, I just needed to confirm what I already knew. I drove past the restaurant she had mentioned. I saw a group of people inside, a mix of guys and girls in gym clothes. But Laura wasn't there. I parked across the street and sat there, feeling my heartbeat thudding in my ears. My mind was already racing with possibilities. Maybe she was running late. Maybe she had just stepped outside. Or maybe she wasn't coming at all. I took a deep breath and called her. She picked up on the second ring, her voice bright and casual. "Hey, babe, what's up?" "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just wanted to see how dinner was going." "Oh, it's great. We just ordered." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Nice. What did you get?" There was a slight pause. Just a salad." I stared at the restaurant, at the group of people sitting inside, laughing and chatting. If Laura was just ordering, why wasn't she here? "That's good," I said slowly. "Who's all there?" She hesitated again, but only for a split second. "Oh, the usual. Some of the girls, a couple of the trainers. Jake's here, too." My stomach twisted. "Sounds fun," I said, keeping my voice light. "Send me a picture. I want to see what you guys are up to." Another pause. "Oh, my phone's about to die," she said quickly. "I'll send you one later, okay?" She hung up before I could say anything else. I sat there in my car, gripping the phone in my hand. She was lying. I knew she was lying. But where was she? I took a guess. I drove straight to Jake's apartment. I had only been there once when he first moved in and invited a few neighbors over for drinks. It was in one of those newer complexes with gated parking, but I knew there was a side entrance that didn't require a key fob. I parked a block away and walked up, my hands clenched at my sides. I had no plan. I didn't even know what I was going to do if I actually found her there. But then, as I turned the corner, I saw it. Laura's car, parked right outside Jake's building. I felt everything inside me go numb. I walked up to the door, my footsteps sounding too loud in my own ears. My hands felt shaky, but I knocked anyway. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard movement inside, whispering, footsteps. The door opened just a crack and Jake stood there, shirtless, looking like he had just been caught sneaking out of a crime scene. "Hey, man," he said, rubbing the back of his neck like this was just some awkward misunderstanding. I pushed the door open the rest of the way, and there she was, Laura, sitting on his couch, wearing one of his oversized T-shirts, her hair still damp from a shower. She froze when she saw me, her face draining of color. "Mike," she started. I held up a hand. "Don't." Silence. Jake stepped back, avoiding my eyes. "Look, man, I turned and walked out. I didn't want to hear excuses. I didn't need to. The proof was right there. I got in my car and drove home. She didn't follow me. She didn't even call. I don't remember much of that night. I sat in the dark for hours, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. I had always thought that if something like this ever happened, I'd be furious. That I'd yell, demand answers, break something, but I didn't. I just felt empty. The next morning, she finally came home. She walked in quietly, her face pale, her eyes red. "Mike?" "Pack your stuff," I said, cutting her off. "We're done." She blinked at me, like she hadn't expected it to be this easy. Like she thought I'd argue, or beg, or at least ask her why. But I already knew why. She hesitated. "Can we just—" "No." She stared at me for a long time. Then, without another word, she turned and walked into the bedroom. I sat there, listening to the sound of her packing, of drawers opening and closing, of zippers being pulled shut. Then finally the front door clicked shut behind her. And just like that, 8 years of my life were gone. Update 1. Laura was gone, but she still lingered in every corner of the house. Her scent was faint on the pillows. Her hair ties still sat in the bathroom drawer, and I kept finding little reminders of her. Half-burned candles, a sweater she left draped over the back of a chair, a pair of shoes by the door like she might walk in any second and slip them on. The house had never felt this quiet before. It wasn't just the lack of her voice or the absence of her humming in the kitchen. It was the weight of it all. The realization that for the first time in 8 years, I was truly alone. At first, I kept moving on autopilot. Wake up, go to work, come home, sleep, repeat. I told myself this was for the best. No more waiting up at night, no more excuses, no more pretending things were fine. I had spent months living with the sinking feeling that something was wrong, and now, at least I knew. There was no more doubt. But the thing about knowing is that it doesn't make the hurt disappear. It just makes it sharper. She called 2 days after she left. I saw her name flash across my screen and let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then came the texts. Nothing long, just short, careful messages, as if she was testing the waters. She asked if we could talk, if I could just hear her out. She told me she was sorry, that she missed me. I stared at my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. I didn't respond. She had all the time in the world to talk before. She could have told me when she felt like something was missing, when she started pulling away, when she let Jake slip into the space between us. But she didn't. Instead, she let me sit in the dark while she found excitement somewhere else. And now, suddenly, she wanted to talk? 3 days later, she showed up at the house. The knock was soft, hesitant. I thought about ignoring it, but some part of me needed to see her face. Needed to see if she'd even have the guts to look me in the eye. She stood on the porch, looking small, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to make herself disappear. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and she wore an old sweatshirt, one I recognized as mine. A cheap trick, making herself look fragile and familiar, like that would somehow soften what she had done. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. She said she was sorry, that she never meant for things to happen the way they did. She said she didn't even know why she had done it, that she had felt confused, lost. She had spent months lying to my face, sneaking around, making excuses. Now she wanted me to believe she just didn't know why? Then she said she missed me, that she made a mistake, that she still loved me. Love isn't something you gamble with. It isn't something you set aside for a thrill and expect to pick back up when it's convenient. If she loved me, she wouldn't have lied. She wouldn't have made me feel like I was crazy for noticing the changes in her, for wondering why she was spending so much time with another man. She wouldn't have walked into Jake's apartment like it was hers, like she belonged there more than she did here. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine, maybe hoping for some sign that I'd soften, that I'd be willing to hear her out. She said she wasn't living with Jake, that she had been staying with her sister. She said she wasn't happy, that being away made her realize what she had lost. She asked if I could just give her a chance to fix things. There was nothing left to fix. She must have realized it then, because her shoulders slumped, and for the first time since she walked back into my life, she didn't try to argue. She wiped her face, nodded, and turned to leave. I watched her walk down the driveway, listened to the sound of her car pulling away. I waited to feel something, anger, sadness, regret, but there was nothing, just relief. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in months. No more waiting for the door to open late at night, no more lying awake, wondering if she was where she said she was. The next morning, I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. The weight of everything pressed down on me, but instead of breaking me, it lifted. She was gone, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The first week after Laura left felt unreal. The house was too quiet. It wasn't just the lack of her voice or the absence of her footsteps in the hallway. It was the weight of the silence itself. I had never noticed how much space another person could take up in a home until she was gone. Mornings were the worst. I would wake up instinctively reaching for the other side of the bed, only to find it cold and empty. It was a habit I didn't even realize I had, muscle memory that hadn't caught up to reality. Her pillow still had an indentation from where she used to sleep, and even though I knew I should flip it over, I left it that way for a few days. The kitchen still smelled like her perfume, faint but persistent. The scent clung to the fabric of the couch where she used to sit with her legs curled up, scrolling through her phone. Her coffee mug was still in the cabinet, untouched. Her favorite blanket was draped over the chair in the living room, as if she might walk in at any second, wrap herself in it, and settle in for the night. I thought about packing up her things right away, but I didn't. It felt too final, too much like admitting that this was real. So instead, I focused on keeping myself busy. Work became my escape. I started staying late, volunteering for projects I wouldn't normally take on. I told myself it was because I wanted to be productive, but in reality, I was just trying to avoid coming home to an empty house. My co-workers noticed the change. Some asked if I was okay. A few suggested grabbing a drink after work. I told them I was fine. They didn't believe me, but they didn't push. Evenings were the hardest. There was nothing to distract me then. I tried watching TV, but every show reminded me of something we used to watch together. I switched to music, but even that wasn't safe. Every playlist had at least one song that brought back a memory I didn't want to think about. Then the messages started. Laura had stopped texting for a few days after she showed up at the house, maybe hoping I'd be the one to reach out first. When I didn't, she tried again. The first message was cautious, as if she wasn't sure if I'd even read it. She said she hoped I was okay. I ignored it. The next day, another message. She said she missed me, that she had been thinking about everything and realized how much she had ruined. Then came a longer one. She told me she wasn't doing well, that she felt like she had made the biggest mistake of her life. She said she couldn't stop thinking about me, about us. She wanted to talk, to meet somewhere, just once. I stared at the message for a long time. She hadn't felt this way when she was sneaking around, lying to my face. She hadn't felt this way when she was spending hours with Jake, pretending everything between us was fine. She only missed me now because she had lost me. I typed out a response, then deleted it. There was nothing to say. A few days later, a mutual friend reached out. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. They asked if I had talked to Laura recently. When I said no, they hesitated, then let out a small laugh. Apparently, things between her and Jake weren't as perfect as she had imagined. The excitement, the thrill, the secrecy. Once that was gone, there was nothing left. Reality had set in, and it wasn't as glamorous as she had expected. She had thrown everything away for him, and now it was falling apart. I should have felt vindicated, maybe even smug, but I didn't. I just felt done. One night I finally decided it was time. I walked through the house, gathering the last of her things. The sweater, the mug, the half-used shampoo in the bathroom. It was strange how small the pile was in the end. 8 years together, and all that was left of her presence in my life fit into a single cardboard box. I didn't overthink it. I drove to a donation center, handed the box over without hesitation, and walked away. She wasn't coming back, and I didn't want her to. When I got home, I took a deep breath and looked around. The house still felt different, but for the first time it didn't feel empty. It felt like mine. I rearranged the furniture just enough to make the space feel new. It was a small change, but it made a difference. That night, I slept without waking up in the middle of the night, without the weight of wondering where she was. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward. The first real sign that I was moving forward came unexpectedly. It had been a few weeks since I packed up Laura's things, and the house was finally starting to feel like mine. The silence wasn't as loud anymore. I was getting used to the extra space, the freedom of not waiting for someone to come home late or pretending not to care when she did. At first, the free time felt unnatural. For years, my schedule had been tied to another person's habits, waiting for her to be ready before heading out, planning weekends around her interests, adjusting my evenings based on her moods. Now, for the first time in nearly a decade, I could do whatever I wanted. The problem was, I wasn't sure what that was. One evening after work, I found myself driving without a destination. I used to love aimless drives, rolling the windows down, playing music without a care in the world. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped doing that. I had stopped doing a lot of things. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a bar I used to go to before I met Laura. It wasn't anything fancy, just a quiet spot with good food and a bartender who actually remembered people's names. I had avoided it for a while because Laura and I had been there together too many times. But that night, I realized something. It wasn't our place. It was mine before she ever came into the picture. I walked in, grabbed a seat at the counter, and ordered a drink. The bartender recognized me immediately. He leaned in and said it had been a while, asked how things were going. I just nodded and told him I'd been busy. He didn't press. Instead, he slid my drink over and moved on to the next customer, giving me space to sit and think. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Laura. I wasn't wondering where she was, what she was doing, or if she was still regretting what she had done. I wasn't even thinking about Jake. I was just existing, and it felt good. Over the next few weeks, I started to reclaim little parts of myself that I hadn't even realized I had lost. I picked up old hobbies again, things I had set aside because Laura either wasn't interested or had made me feel like they weren't important. I started reading again, something I used to love but had stopped because it didn't fit into our routine. I went back to the gym, not because I felt like I had to prove anything, but because it felt good to push myself. Friends started reaching out more, probably noticing that I was finally pulling myself out of whatever hole I had been in. At first, I turned down invitations, still feeling like I wasn't fully ready to be social again. But eventually, I gave in. I met up with an old friend for lunch, then another for a drink after work. Slowly, life started feeling normal again. One night, I was out with a few friends when someone new joined the group. She was a friend of a friend, introduced casually over drinks. She had a warm laugh and an easygoing way about her, the kind of energy that didn't feel forced. At one point in the conversation, she turned to me and asked how I knew everyone. Without thinking, I told her a quick version of the truth. I had just gone through a breakup, and I was reconnecting with people I hadn't seen in a while. She tilted her head, studying me for a second, then just nodded. She didn't ask for details, didn't press for some dramatic story. She just smiled and said that was good, that it was nice to have a solid group of friends to lean on. And that was it. No pity, no awkwardness, just a normal conversation. I had spent so much time feeling like my breakup was this massive thing that defined me, like I was walking around with a giant sign that said betrayed and recovering. But in that moment, I realized something. It was just a part of my story, not the whole thing. I wasn't just the guy who got cheated on. I was someone who was moving forward, figuring things out, and finding pieces of himself again. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. A few months had passed, and life felt different. Not just because Laura was gone, but because, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying the weight of what happened. The pain that had once felt like a constant presence had faded into something else, just a memory. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't replaying old conversations in my head, wondering where things had gone wrong. I wasn't waiting for another message from her, expecting one last apology or explanation. I had moved on. The biggest sign of that was when I finally stopped caring about whether she and Jake were still together. At first, I had been curious, checking social media or waiting for someone to casually mention it in conversation. But eventually, it just didn't matter. Whether they were happy, miserable, or had already gone their separate ways, it had nothing to do with me anymore. One afternoon, I got a text from an old coworker asking if I wanted to come to a small get-together. Nothing big, just a few friends grilling in someone's backyard. A few months ago, I would have said no. I would have made up some excuse, told myself I wasn't in the mood, but now I found myself saying yes without hesitation. When I arrived, I was greeted with a cold beer and a few familiar faces. The atmosphere was light, full of laughter and easy conversations. It had been a long time since I felt that kind of comfort, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. At some point in the evening, I ended up talking to someone new. She was standing near the grill, debating whether or not to take another plate of food. When I joked that the extra calories didn't count at barbecues, she laughed and agreed, piling more onto her plate. The conversation flowed effortlessly. We talked about everything and nothing. Movies we both liked, places we had traveled, the best food spots in town. She had a way of making every topic seem interesting, of pulling people in without even trying. At one point, she asked if I lived nearby. I told her I did, that I had been in the area for a while. I almost mentioned Laura out of habit, the way I used to when talking about where I lived. But then I realized I didn't need to. This was my life now. She smiled and said she liked the neighborhood. Before we left that night, she asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. I said yes. It wasn't anything serious. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but it felt good to say yes, to something new, to something unknown. Driving home that night, I realized just how far I had come. For so long, I had been focused on what I lost, on the betrayal, on the unfairness of it all. I had wasted so much energy thinking about the past, about Laura, about the way things ended. But now I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was thinking about what was ahead. For the first time in a long time, The future didn't feel like something I had to rebuild from the ground up. It just felt open, and I was ready for it. Story 6. I caught my husband and sister naked in my kitchen, and now I have to pick up the pieces of betrayal to build a new life without them. I always thought my life was solid, built on trust and stability, a marriage that wasn't perfect but felt unbreakable, and a relationship with my sister that had been my anchor through every storm. I believed in the little moments, the quiet reassurances, the simple gestures of love and loyalty that made everything feel safe. I never imagined that in a single moment, everything I held dear would be ripped apart, leaving me gasping for air, drowning in betrayal so deep that I could feel it crushing me from the inside out. That day, I wasn't supposed to be home early. Work had wrapped up sooner than expected, and I figured I'd take advantage of the free time, grab a bottle of wine, and surprise my husband with an impromptu date night. Maybe we'd order takeout, curl up on the couch, and enjoy the kind of evening that had been missing from our routine lately. As I pulled into the driveway, my sister's car caught my eye, and for a brief moment I smiled, thinking maybe she had brought something over from her restaurant, a thoughtful gesture she did often, always insisting I needed to try whatever new dish she had perfected. She had a key, and she was always welcome in my home, so I thought nothing of it as I stepped inside, expecting to hear her voice chatting away with my husband, maybe laughing about some childhood memory or telling him one of her ridiculous work stories. But the house was quiet, eerily so, the kind of silence that immediately makes your stomach tighten, that instinctive, primal sense that something is terribly wrong creeping up your spine before your mind can fully catch up. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my ears straining for any familiar sound, but what I heard wasn't laughter or conversation. It was something low, muffled, and unmistakably intimate, something that made my heart slam against my ribs as my breath hitched in my throat. I turned the corner into the kitchen, the space I had poured my heart into designing, a place that symbolized warmth and family, and in that instant, it became the scene of a nightmare that I would never wake up from. My husband and my sister, tangled together in the most unforgivable way, their bare skin illuminated by the soft afternoon light streaming through the windows, completely oblivious to the world around them. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, my body locking up as though I had been physically struck, my lungs refusing to pull in air, as if the oxygen had been stolen from the room entirely. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to shatter the moment into 1,000 irreparable pieces, but the only thing I could do was turn and walk away, my legs moving on autopilot as I stumbled back through the door, barely registering the sound of my own footsteps against the pavement. I don't even remember getting into my car or pulling out of the driveway, but suddenly I was driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my vision blurred by the flood of tears I refused to let fall. I just kept going, block after block, mile after mile, as if I could outrun the image that was now seared into my mind, as if distance could somehow erase the betrayal that had taken root deep inside me. It wasn't until I found myself in front of a hotel, staring blankly at the neon vacancy sign flickering against the darkening sky, that I realized I had no idea where I was going, no plan, no idea what came next. All I knew was that I couldn't go home, not now, maybe not ever. I stepped inside, my body moving on autopilot as I handed over my credit card at the front desk, barely registering the clerk's polite smile or the sound of the keycard sliding across the counter. The moment I was alone in the small, impersonal room, the dam inside me broke, and I crumbled onto the bed, my entire body racked with sobs so violent that I thought they might tear me apart. I had spent my whole life believing that love meant trust, that family meant loyalty, that the people you cherished most would always protect you from pain. But as I lay there, the weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest, I realized how naive I had been, how foolish it was to think that love alone was enough to keep people from destroying you. I don't know how long I lay there staring at the ceiling, my body too exhausted to move, my mind too shattered to make sense of anything. Time blurred into something meaningless, slipping between my fingers like sand, and I let it. Anything was better than thinking. Anything was better than remembering what I had seen. But the problem with pain is that it doesn't fade just because you ignore it. It lingers, tightening its grip around your throat, squeezing the air from your lungs until you're forced to confront it. And when I did, the reality of it all came crashing down on me like a tidal wave, pulling me under, leaving me gasping and grasping for something, anything, to hold on to. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked it, only to realize I had no one to call. The two people I would have turned to in a moment like this were the very ones who had shattered my world. My husband, the man who had vowed to love and cherish me. My sister, my only real family, the one person I had trusted above all others. Both of them had betrayed me in the cruelest way imaginable, and suddenly I felt smaller than I ever had before. A single text notification sat on my screen, the name burning into my retinas like a cruel joke. Ryan. My husband. The man I had given my heart to. The man I had built a life with. I couldn't bring myself to open it, but my thumb hovered over the message anyway, some pathetic, broken part of me, desperate for an explanation, as if any words he could say would make this hurt any less. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to tap on the notification. "Ryan, please, just talk to me. Let me explain." Explain. As if there was an explanation for this. As if anything could justify what he had done. I clenched my jaw, my entire body tense as I stared at the words, bile rising in my throat at the sheer audacity of it all. I wanted to reply, to scream at him, to make him feel even a fraction of the agony that was consuming me from the inside out. But I knew that nothing I said would ever be enough. There was no way to make him understand the depth of his betrayal, no way to make him feel the way I felt right now, utterly broken, completely alone. Without another thought, I blocked his number. Then, with a deep breath and shaking fingers, I did the same to my sister. If they wanted to explain themselves, they could scream into the void for all I cared. They no longer existed in my world. But even as I severed that last fragile thread connecting us, the pain didn't lessen. It sat there, heavy and suffocating, curling around me like a vice. I needed air. I needed to get out of this suffocating hotel room, away from the four walls that felt like they were closing in on me. I grabbed my keys, slipping my shoes on hastily before stepping out into the night. The air was cool, crisp against my overheated skin, and I inhaled deeply, trying to ground myself, trying to push away the thoughts clawing at the edges of my mind. I walked aimlessly, my feet moving without direction, my thoughts racing too fast for me to catch hold of anything concrete. Faces blurred past me, strangers living their ordinary lives, completely unaware of the storm raging inside of me. I envied them. I envied their normalcy, their peace, their ignorance. Eventually, I found myself at a small diner on the corner of an empty street, the warm glow of the neon sign beckoning me inside. I slipped into a booth near the window, my hands wrapped around the menu, though I had no intention of ordering anything. The waitress, a kind-looking woman in her 50s, approached with a soft smile, her voice gentle as she asked if I wanted coffee. I nodded wordlessly, too drained to do anything else. As she walked away, I let my head fall into my hands, the exhaustion pressing down on me so heavily that I thought I might collapse under the weight of it. I wasn't just mourning my marriage. I wasn't just mourning my sister's betrayal. I was mourning the version of myself that had believed in them, that had trusted so blindly, that had built a life on a foundation that was now nothing more than rubble. And the worst part? I had no idea what to do next. I sat in that diner for what felt like hours, my hands wrapped around the steaming cup of coffee that I had barely touched, my mind spiraling in a million different directions, trying to make sense of the senseless, trying to stitch together the pieces of my broken reality. But no matter how many times I replayed the scene in my head, no matter how much I searched for some hidden sign that I had missed, there was nothing. Just a cruel, cold betrayal staring me right in the face. I thought about my sister, the person who had been my shadow growing up, the one I used to sneak into bed with when we were kids after a bad dream, the one who had held my hand at our mother's funeral, the one who had always promised that no matter what, we would always have each other. I had defended her more times than I could count, stood by her when she made reckless choices, picked her up when she fell, and now, when I least expected it, she had driven the sharpest knife straight into my back, twisting it without hesitation. Then there was Ryan, my husband, the man I had built a life with, the person I had trusted enough to share my dreams, my fears, my heart, the man who had looked me in the eye just weeks ago and told me he loved me, told me he couldn't imagine his life without me, told me I was his forever. How easy it must have been for him to lie. How effortless it must have been to betray me while still kissing me goodbye in the mornings, while still whispering goodnight against my skin, while still pretending that he was the man I thought I married. A part of me wanted to storm back home, to throw open the door and demand answers, to make them both feel as small, as shattered, as worthless as they had made me feel in that moment. But another part of me, the part that was too raw, too exposed, too fragile to handle any more pain, knew that I couldn't face them, not yet, maybe not ever. I didn't want to hear their excuses, their half-hearted apologies, their pathetic attempts to justify the unjustifiable, because there was no explanation that could ever erase what they had done, no words that could undo the way they had burned everything we had built to the ground. I didn't even know who I was anymore without them, without the life I had spent years building, without the identity that had been so deeply intertwined with being Ryan's wife and my sister's best friend. It was like staring into a void, an empty, endless nothingness where my future used to be, and the thought of starting over, of rebuilding from the ashes, felt impossible, felt exhausting, felt like a burden I wasn't ready to carry. At some point I realized I couldn't sit there forever, couldn't just disappear into the cracked vinyl of the diner booth, no matter how much I wanted to. The world outside hadn't stopped spinning just because mine had shattered, and whether I liked it or not, I had to figure out what came next, even if every step forward felt like dragging my body through quicksand. I paid for the coffee I hadn't touched, offered the kind waitress a small, forced smile, and stepped back out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin as I walked back toward the hotel, my mind still heavy with the weight of everything I couldn't escape. I had no idea what I was supposed to do next, no idea where I was supposed to go from here, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened, I would never let them see me break. Update. Reality hits hard. I woke up in that stiff hotel bed with my body aching, my head pounding, and a deep emptiness settled in my chest, the kind of emptiness that made it hard to breathe, the kind that reminded me over and over again that nothing would ever be the same again, that I'd gone to sleep in one life and woken up in another, a life where trust was a fragile illusion, a life where the people I had loved the most had destroyed me without a second thought. For a few blissful seconds, in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, I had forgotten, my brain still clinging to the familiar routine of my mornings, expecting to hear the soft hum of the coffee machine in the kitchen, expecting to feel Ryan's warm body beside me, expecting to reach for my phone and see a message from my sister asking something mundane like if I wanted to grab lunch or borrow one of her sweaters. But then reality came crashing down like a wrecking ball, ripping through the thin veil of forgetfulness and dragging me right back into the nightmare I was now living. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, listening to the muffled sounds of life happening beyond the walls of the hotel room, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional laugh of a stranger in the hallway, the clinking of dishes from the hotel's breakfast bar downstairs. All of it reminding me that the world was still moving forward, even though mine had completely fallen apart. And for the first time since I had walked in on them, I let myself wonder, what were they doing right now? Had they even bothered looking for me? Or had they already moved on, sweeping the wreckage of my life under the rug like it was nothing more than an inconvenient mess they didn't want to deal with? Had Ryan slept in our bed alone last night, or had my sister taken my place before the sheets had even cooled? Had they felt guilt, shame, regret, or had they simply accepted that this was their new reality, as if I had never existed, as if the life I had shared with them had never mattered? I hated myself for caring, hated myself for letting the questions eat away at me, hated that somewhere deep down there was still a small, pathetic part of me that wanted to believe there was an explanation. that wanted to believe Ryan would burst through that door with tears in his eyes, telling me it was all a mistake, that he had been weak, that he had been stupid, that he still loved me, that he would do anything to fix this. But I knew better. I had seen the truth with my own eyes. I had watched my entire world collapse in the span of a single breath, and no amount of words, no amount of apologies, would ever erase that image from my mind. I reached for my phone out of instinct, expecting nothing but silence. But instead, I was met with dozens of notifications, missed calls, unread messages, frantic voicemails, all from Ryan, all from my sister, their desperation bleeding through the screen, their attempts to reach me growing more frantic with each passing hour. And for a moment I felt the sick satisfaction of knowing they were panicking, knowing they were scrambling, knowing they were feeling even an ounce of the agony they had inflicted on me. But then I opened the messages, and any satisfaction I had felt was immediately swallowed by disgust. Because instead of confessions, instead of remorse, instead of anything that even remotely resembled accountability, all I saw were excuses, pathetic attempts to justify the unjustifiable, Ryan telling me it wasn't what it looked like, that he had been drunk, that it had just happened, that he hadn't meant to hurt me, my sister pleading with me to talk to her, telling me she had been lost, that she had made a mistake, that she still loved me, as if love was supposed to make this any better, as if love was supposed to erase the betrayal that had already been carved into my soul. I blocked them both without hesitation, my hands steady, my resolve unshakable, because I refused to let them poison me any further. I refused to let them spin their lies into something digestible. I refused to give them the satisfaction of thinking they could manipulate me into forgiving them, because forgiveness wasn't an option, because they had made their choice, and now they would have to live with it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't break down like I had the night before. Instead, I stood up, grabbed my bag, walked out of that hotel room, and told myself that from this moment on, I wasn't running away. I was moving forward, and I would never, ever look back. Walking out of that hotel felt like stepping into a world that no longer belonged to me, like I had been plucked from my own life and dropped into someone else's. A stranger wandering through a place that should have felt familiar but now felt foreign, the air tasting different, the weight in my chest making it hard to breathe, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, to ground myself in a reality that didn't feel like it was crumbling beneath my feet. I had no destination in mind, no plan, no clear vision of what the next few days, weeks, or even months would look like. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't go back to that house, to that bed, to that kitchen where everything had fallen apart in an instant, where I had stood frozen in the doorway, watching my world disintegrate in front of me, unable to do anything except walk away before the weight of it crushed me completely. I didn't want to see the furniture we had picked out together, the wedding photos still hanging on the walls, the carefully arranged reminders of a love that had never been real, all of it mocking me, whispering that I had been a fool, that I had built my life around a lie, that the people I had trusted most had been capable of destroying me so effortlessly, as if I had never mattered to them at all. But even though I knew I couldn't stay, I also knew I couldn't just disappear forever, couldn't just abandon the life I had spent years building without taking something back, something that was mine, something that wasn't tainted by their betrayal. So I found myself driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my heart pounding as I pulled onto the street that I had once called home. The sight of that house, of that driveway, of that front door that had once felt like safety now filling me with nothing but dread. I parked down the street, taking a deep breath, forcing myself to move even as every part of me screamed to turn around, to run, to forget. But I wouldn't let them take everything from me. I wouldn't let them make me a ghost in my own story. So I walked up the path, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door, stepping into the silence of a home that no longer felt like mine, my eyes darting around the space, searching for any sign that they had been here, that they had moved on, that they had already rewritten the story without me in it. But the house was empty. No sign of Ryan, no sign of my sister. Just the eerie quiet of a place that had once been filled with laughter, with warmth, with love, now hollow and cold, a monument to everything I had lost. I moved quickly, my body operating on autopilot as I grabbed a suitcase from the hall closet, shoving clothes into it without bothering to fold them, grabbing my laptop, my documents, the things that were mine, the things that weren't tainted by their betrayal, refusing to give myself time to think, to break, to let the pain sink in any deeper than it already had. As I zipped up the suitcase, my eyes landed on the framed wedding photo sitting on the mantel, the one I had once cherished, the one that had captured a moment of happiness so perfect that I had believed, truly believed, that it would last forever. I picked it up, staring at the faces of two people who no longer existed, two people who had stood in front of friends and family, vowing to love and honor and protect each other, only for one of them to shatter those promises in the worst possible way. Without thinking, I hurled the frame against the wall, the glass shattering on impact, the sound sharp and violent, filling the silence with something real, something tangible, something that felt like release, like defiance, like proof that I was still here, still standing, still fighting. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I didn't let myself mourn what was already dead. Instead, I grabbed my suitcase, took one last look around the house that had once been my home, and walked out, closing the door behind me without a second glance, stepping into the unknown, into the uncertainty, into a future that was mine and mine alone. And as I drove away, the weight in my chest still heavy but no longer suffocating, I realized something. I had survived. They had taken everything from me, but they hadn't destroyed me. I was still here, and that was enough. Story 7. I, 35M, found a condom wrapper in my wife's, 34F car, and now I can't stop questioning everything. Was our marriage ever real? Or has she been betraying me behind my back while I lived in blissful ignorance? For 10 years, Sarah and I had built a life together, 6 of those as husband and wife, and though we hadn't yet started a family, we had been on the verge of trying, planning for the future, imagining what our lives would look like as parents, and making all the necessary changes to prepare for that next chapter. Our relationship had always been solid, or at least that's what I had believed. We were best friends first, the kind of couple who could spend hours talking about anything and everything, who laughed at the same jokes, who never seemed to run out of things to say. We had passion, we had trust, and we had a bond that I thought was unshakable. Sarah was stunning, the kind of woman who didn't have to try to be noticed. Long dark hair, sharp green eyes, a fit and toned figure from years of dedication to the gym. She was effortlessly beautiful. Me? I was average at best, but I never let that bother me because Sarah had chosen me, and for the longest time I had believed that what we had went beyond just looks. We had always been active together, hitting the gym, eating clean, prioritizing our health. Sarah had always been more dedicated than I was, often staying longer, pushing herself harder and making fitness a central part of her daily routine. It never bothered me. If anything, I admired her discipline. That was before I found the condom wrapper. It was a routine Saturday afternoon. I had been washing Sarah's car like I always did, scrubbing the exterior, vacuuming the seats, and clearing out any loose receipts or clutter from the interior. I had done this dozens of times, never expecting to find anything unusual, but when I reached under the passenger seat, my fingers brushed against something crinkled and small. I pulled it out, expecting a stray gum wrapper or an old receipt. It was an empty condom wrapper. My brain didn't register it at first. I just stared at it, my fingers tightening around the thin foil, my heart slamming against my ribs as the realization set in. Sarah and I didn't use condoms. We hadn't used them since the beginning of our relationship. She had been on birth control for years. We had been actively trying for a baby. There was no reason for this to be here. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind all at once, each one worse than the last. Had it been there for a long time? Was it old? No, that didn't make sense. I cleaned her car regularly, going through every inch of it at least once a month. If this had been there before, I would have found it. Had someone else borrowed her car? Maybe a friend? But Sarah never let anyone drive her car. She was particular about that, always preferring to be the one behind the wheel. Then the thought I had been avoiding hit me like a punch to the gut. What if this was recent? I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting as I tried to breathe through the sudden wave of nausea. Sarah spent a lot of time at the gym. 3, sometimes 4 hours a day, 4 days a week, staying late, taking extra classes, always pushing herself, always coming home exhausted. I had never questioned it before, never even thought to. But now, every moment she had spent away from me, every extra hour at the gym, every time she came home and went straight to the shower, it all played back in my mind in slow motion, the pieces shifting into place in a way that made my chest tighten. I needed, to believe there was a rational explanation, something that didn't involve betrayal, something that wouldn't unravel everything I had built my life around. But deep down in the part of me that had always trusted her without hesitation, there was now a whisper of doubt, a nagging voice that I couldn't ignore. I clenched the wrapper in my fist, my hands shaking. Sarah was inside, probably sitting on the couch, completely unaware that my entire world had just tilted on its axis. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure if I could trust the woman I had vowed to spend my life with. I had to confront her. But the thought of looking her in the eye and asking the question that could change everything made my stomach churn. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, my mind running in circles, replaying every conversation, every moment, every sign I might have missed. She was my entire world. And yet I knew, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much I wished I could turn back time and unsee what I had found, I needed the truth, even if it shattered me. The condom wrapper sat in my pocket like a dead weight, a small but undeniable piece of evidence that refused to let me rest, gnawing at the edges of my sanity, making every second I spent pretending everything was fine feel like an unbearable act of self-betrayal. I had spent the past 12 hours in complete turmoil, my thoughts circling the same question over and over. How do you ask the woman you love, the person you built your entire world around, if she has been unfaithful without completely shattering everything in the process? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't stay silent. That evening, as Sarah walked through the front door, her gym bag slung over her shoulder, her face glowing with that post-workout flush she always had, I found myself watching her in a way I never had before, scanning every detail, every movement, every flicker of expression, searching desperately for a sign, something that might confirm or contradict the sickening suspicion growing inside me. She smiled at me, the same easy, affectionate smile she had given me 1,000 times before, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I almost convinced myself that I was wrong, that there had to be an explanation, that the love we had built over the past 10 years wasn't something she could so easily throw away. But then I remembered the wrapper, and the doubt came crashing back. I waited until she had settled in, until she was standing in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of water, her body relaxed, her mind elsewhere, completely unaware that I was about to throw a grenade into the middle of our lives. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the condom wrapper and placed it on the counter between us. Her reaction wasn't immediate. For a second, she just stared at it, her brows knitting together in confusion, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't quite form the words. Then she laughed. A soft, incredulous chuckle. The kind of laugh someone gives when they're caught off guard by something completely absurd. And the sound of it made my stomach turn because there was nothing funny about this. Nothing remotely humorous about the fact that I had spent the past day questioning everything I thought I knew about our marriage. "Are you serious?" she asked, shaking her head slightly, the corners of her mouth still tugging upward in amusement. "What? What is this?" I didn't return her smile. "I found it in your car," I said, my voice tight, controlled but barely masking the storm raging inside me. "Under the passenger seat." The amusement in her eyes faltered. Her expression shifted, not to guilt, not to panic, but to something else, something I couldn't quite place. She reached for the wrapper, picking it up between her fingers, turning it over as if she needed to see it to believe it was real, her lips pressing into a thin line, her brows furrowing deeper. "I don't know what to tell you," she finally said, her voice calm, too calm. "I have no idea how this got there." I clenched my jaw, my patience wearing thin. "That's not good enough," I said, my words coming out sharper than I intended. "We don't use condoms, Sarah. You've been on birth control since we started dating. So tell me how this ended up in your car." Her eyes flickered just for a second. Was that hesitation? A moment of doubt? Then she exhaled through her nose and shrugged. "Maybe it's old," she offered. "Maybe it was from before we even got together and it just—" "Don't," I cut in, shaking my head, feeling my pulse hammering in my skull. "I clean your car all the time. If it had been there before, I would have found it." Silence. For the first time, she looked genuinely unsettled, like she was realizing that this wasn't something she could just brush off, that I wasn't going to let it go, that no amount of nonchalant deflection was going to make me back down. "I don't know what you want me to say," she finally murmured, her voice softer now, like she was trying to tread carefully, as if she knew she was standing on dangerous ground. "I swear to you, I have no idea where it came from." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But something in my gut told me that this wasn't over, that this was only the beginning. The silence that followed felt like it stretched on forever, an unbearable, suffocating void between us, thick with tension and unspoken accusations, and no matter how many times I replayed the last few minutes in my mind, dissecting every word, every flicker of expression on her face, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong, that no matter how much she insisted she had no idea where the condom wrapper had come from, no matter how steady her voice was, no matter how casual she tried to appear, there was something beneath the surface, something I could feel more than I could see, a quiet, invisible shift in the foundation of our marriage, a crack that had begun to form, one that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. I watched her closely, trying to force myself to see her as a stranger might, to remove the years of love and trust and shared memories that clouded my judgment, to push aside the part of me that desperately wanted to believe that she was telling the truth, that she was just as confused as I was, that there was some kind of ridiculous, improbable, but ultimately innocent explanation for all of this, because the alternative, the possibility that she was lying, that she had betrayed me, that the life we had built together was no longer what I thought it was too much to bear. But no matter how much I wanted to ignore it, my gut refused to let me. That instinctive primal voice inside me screaming that something wasn't adding up, that her reaction wasn't quite right, that the way she had laughed, the way she had brushed it off so casually, the way she had looked at me, not with shock or outrage or even fear, but with a measured sort of patience, like she was waiting for me to accept her answer rather than genuinely trying to convince me, all pointed to one thing. She was hiding something. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice even, controlled, despite the storm raging inside me. "Sarah," I said slowly, my fingers pressing into the counter, my knuckles turning white from the force of it. "I need you to be honest with me right now. I need you to tell me the truth. Because if there's something going on, if there's something you need to tell me, it's better if you just say it now." Her expression flickered just for a second, so quick I almost missed it, but it was there, a brief moment of hesitation, her eyes darting away from mine before she schooled her features back into neutrality, crossing her arms over her chest in that defensive way she always did when she felt cornered, when she felt like she was being accused of something she didn't want to admit to. And I knew in that moment that she was lying, that even if she wasn't outright confessing to anything, even if she wasn't saying the words, the truth was there, hanging in the air between us, waiting to be uncovered. "I don't know what else you want me to say," she murmured, her voice softer now, almost pleading, her fingers tracing small nervous circles on the surface of the countertop. "I've already told you everything I know. I don't know where it came from. I don't know how it got in my car, and I don't appreciate being interrogated like this when I haven't done anything wrong." I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm, to stay rational, even as frustration clawed at the edges of my patience, even as every fiber of my being screamed at me to push harder, to demand more, to make her tell me the truth. But I knew that wouldn't get me anywhere, that if she was hiding something, if she had already decided she wasn't going to tell me, then no amount of pressure or anger was going to change that. At least not right now. So instead, I stepped back, nodding once, a sharp, jerky motion that felt more like a physical manifestation of the battle raging inside me than an actual response, and then, without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, still holding the condom wrapper between her fingers like it was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve, like she was just as confused as I was, except I wasn't sure I believed that anymore. That night I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning in endless circles, retracing every moment of our relationship, searching for signs I might have missed, moments I had overlooked, patterns that now seemed obvious in hindsight, and for the first time in my marriage I didn't feel safe, didn't feel secure, didn't feel like I was lying next to the person I had vowed to spend the rest of my life with. I felt like I was lying next to a stranger, and I knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling in the suffocating darkness of our bedroom, listening to the steady rhythm of Sarah's breathing beside me, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that I was jumping to conclusions, that maybe, just maybe, she really didn't know where that condom wrapper had come from, there was something inside me, something raw, something instinctual, that refused to accept her answer, that refused to believe that this was just some weird coincidence, some harmless misunderstanding that could be explained away with enough rationalization. Because the truth was, trust isn't just about words, it's about feeling. And right now I didn't feel right. I turned my head slightly, watching the soft rise and fall of Sarah's chest, the way her lips were slightly parted, the way she looked so peaceful, so utterly at ease, like she wasn't lying next to a man whose entire world had just been turned upside down, like she hadn't just spent the evening giving me the most lukewarm, half-hearted denial I had ever heard. And the longer I stared at her, the more I realized that I couldn't just let this go, that I couldn't just swallow my suspicions and move on like nothing had happened, because if I did, if I trusted her without proof, then I would never be able to look at her the same way again. I needed answers, and if she wasn't going to give them to me, I was going to find them myself. The next morning, I woke up early, long before Sarah, slipping out of bed as quietly as I could, my mind already racing with possibilities, with strategies, with all the ways I could go about figuring out the truth without tipping her off that I was even looking. I started with the easiest thing, her phone. She kept it on her nightstand, right where she always did, face down, the screen dark and lifeless, and as I stood there staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest, I felt a pang of guilt, because wasn't this exactly the kind of behavior that destroyed relationships? The sneaking, the paranoia, the invasion of privacy. But then I remembered that condom wrapper, that sickening doubt that had been planted in my mind. And suddenly, the guilt didn't seem so heavy anymore. I reached for the phone, careful not to make a sound, my fingers barely brushing against the smooth glass, before the screen suddenly lit up with a notification. Missed call, unknown number. My stomach clenched. I glanced at Sarah, still asleep, still blissfully unaware. And without thinking, I swiped the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears as I navigated to her call log, scanning through the most recent entries, looking for anything unusual, anything out of place, anything that might explain why my gut was telling me that something was very, very wrong. And that's when I saw it. The same unknown number had called her 4 times in the past 3 days. No name, no saved contact, no indication of who it might be, just the same repeated number, like someone was trying to reach her, like someone was trying to get through to her and she wasn't answering. My throat tightened as I clicked on the number, my thumb hovering over the callback button, my brain at war with itself, one side screaming at me to put the phone down, to stop before I crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and the other side, the louder side, telling me that I had already crossed it, that I was already in too deep, that the only way forward now was through. But before I could press it, before I could do anything, I heard a groggy voice behind me. "What are you doing?" I spun around, nearly dropping the phone, my stomach twisting as I met Sarah's sleepy, slightly confused gaze, her brows furrowed as she propped herself up on one elbow, blinking at me in the dim morning light. I hesitated for only a second before forcing a casual shrug, holding up the phone like it was nothing, like I wasn't in the middle of something I had no business doing. Your phone was buzzing, I said, my voice as neutral as I could make it. You got a call from an unknown number. Her expression barely changed, just a flicker of something unreadable before she reached for the phone, taking it from my hand, glancing at the screen like she was only mildly interested. "Oh," she murmured, swiping the notification away before setting the phone back down on the nightstand. "It's probably just spam." My jaw tightened. 4 calls in 3 days? I asked, keeping my tone light, nonchalant, even though my insides felt like they were twisting into knots. That's a little persistent for spam, don't you think? She let out a small breath, shaking her head as she pushed herself fully upright, rubbing her face like she was still trying to shake off sleep. "I don't know," she said, her voice exasperated now, like she was already tired of this conversation. "I get random calls all the time. It's not a big deal." I didn't respond. I just nodded slowly, my mind racing because I could tell that she was lying. Maybe it was the way she had dismissed it so quickly, the way she had barely even looked at the number before brushing it off, the way her voice had changed, just slightly, shifting into that careful, measured tone people use when they're trying too hard to sound casual, but whatever it was, I knew. She was hiding something, and I wasn't going to stop until I found out what it was. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers drumming against the wood, my mind spiraling through every possibility, every potential explanation for the things I had uncovered. And yet, no matter how many scenarios I tried to construct, no matter how much I attempted to rationalize, to find a version of events where Sarah wasn't lying to me, I kept arriving at the same place, the same dark, sinking realization that something was very, very wrong. Sarah moved around the kitchen like nothing was out of the ordinary, humming to herself as she made her usual morning smoothie, completely unaware, or maybe entirely too aware, of the fact that I was sitting there watching her, analyzing every movement, every subtle shift in her expression, looking for a sign, a tell, anything that might confirm what my gut had already decided, that the woman I had trusted with my entire life, the woman I had spent a decade believing in, was keeping something from me. I cleared my throat, testing the weight of my words before I spoke. "So, you never answered me?" Sarah paused, her hand tightening slightly around the blender lid, the smallest hesitation before she turned to look at me with carefully constructed confusion. "About what?" I leaned back, crossing my arms over my chest, leveling my gaze at her. "The phone calls," I said, keeping my voice as even as possible. "You just brushed them off earlier, but 4 calls in 3 days doesn't sound like spam. It sounds like someone really wants to get in touch with you." Her lips pressed into a thin line, the muscles in her jaw tightening. "I told you," she said slowly, carefully, like she was choosing each word with precision. "I don't know who it is. And frankly, I don't see why you're making such a big deal about it." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head as I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You don't see why I'd be concerned?" I asked, my voice taking on an edge I hadn't intended but didn't bother to reel in. "Sarah, I found a condom wrapper in your car. We don't use condoms. Then I find out someone's been calling you repeatedly, and you're acting like I'm crazy for wondering if there's a connection." Something flickered across her face, brief but unmistakable. "Annoyance." She sighed heavily, setting her smoothie cup down on the counter with a little too much force. "This again?" she muttered, rubbing her temples like she was dealing with a child throwing a tantrum. "I already told you, I don't know where the wrapper came from. And as for the calls, maybe it's a telemarketer, maybe it's a wrong number, maybe it's a damn coincidence. But you know what isn't a coincidence? You suddenly deciding to go full-blown detective on me over nothing." My stomach twisted at the way she said that, nothing. Like I was being irrational, like I was blowing things out of proportion, like I was the problem. I stood up abruptly, pushing my chair back with a scrape against the floor. "So that's it?" I asked, my pulse hammering against my skull. "That's all you're gonna say? No real explanation? No attempt to ease my concerns? Just dismissing it like I'm some paranoid lunatic?" Sarah threw up her hands, exasperation etched into every line of her face. "What do you want from me?" she snapped, her voice rising now, her patience wearing thin. "Do you want me to make something up just so you feel better? Because I can't. I don't have an answer because there is no answer. You're looking for something that isn't there." I clenched my fists, staring at her, willing myself to see the truth, to push past the gaslighting, past the deflection, past the way she was trying to twist this around on me. But I didn't need to push any further, because I already knew. I knew that if she were innocent, if she truly had nothing to hide, she wouldn't be acting like this. She wouldn't be deflecting, she wouldn't be minimizing, she wouldn't be getting defensive and irritated and shifting the blame onto me like I was the one tearing our marriage apart. She would be upset. She would be hurt that I even had doubts. She would prove to me that she had nothing to hide. But instead, she was standing there, looking at me with barely concealed frustration, as if I was the one creating the problem, as if I was the one ruining what we had. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just paranoia. This wasn't me overreacting. This was real. And the worst part? She wasn't even trying to stop me from believing it. I let out a slow, controlled breath, nodding to myself as the decision solidified in my mind. "All right," I said, stepping back, my voice eerily calm. "If that's the case, then I need some time to think." Sarah's brows furrowed. "Think about what?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my chest tight. "About whether or not I can trust you." Her mouth opened, then closed again, her eyes searching mine, but I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing in the kitchen, leaving behind the life I thought we had, leaving behind the woman I wasn't sure I even knew anymore. Because sometimes the hardest part about discovering the truth isn't the discovery itself. It's realizing that the person you love isn't going to fight to keep you from walking away. I drove without knowing exactly where I was going, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my heart pounding against my ribs in a dull, relentless rhythm that echoed the single, unshakable truth circling my mind. There was no coming back from this, no undoing what had been done, no salvaging the wreckage of what had once been my marriage, because no matter how much Sarah tried to pretend that there was still something left to fight for, no matter how many empty reassurances she offered, no matter how carefully she measured her words, refusing to admit outright what I already knew, the reality of her betrayal had settled deep into my bones, and I could feel it there, heavy and cold, an undeniable weight that I would never be able to ignore or forget or explain away. Because once trust is broken in this way, once the doubt takes root, it never truly leaves. And even if I wanted to pretend otherwise, even if I wanted to be the kind of man who could forgive, who could push past the unbearable sting of knowing that the person he had loved, the person he had built a life with, had chosen to lie, to deceive, to betray, I wasn't that man, and I never would be. I thought about turning back, about confronting her one last time, about demanding that she give me something real, something tangible, something that would make sense of all of this, because even though I had all the pieces in front of me, even though I had spent the past 24 hours slowly piecing together the puzzle of her infidelity, even though the unknown number had practically confirmed everything without needing to be spelled out, there was still a part of me, deep down, buried beneath the anger and the hurt and the overwhelming exhaustion, that needed to hear her say it, needed her to look me in the eye and admit what she had done, because maybe then I could finally put this to rest. Maybe then I could walk away without feeling like I had left something unfinished, like there was still a question hanging in the air between us, unanswered. But I knew, God, I knew, that I would never get that Sarah would never admit to anything, not because she was innocent, but because she was cowardly, because she would rather let me spiral, let me drive myself insane, questioning what was real and what wasn't, rather than face the truth head-on and say the words that would finally destroy whatever fragile thread was still holding our marriage together. So I kept driving, past the familiar streets that had once felt like home, past the places that had been ours, our favorite coffee shop, the park where we used to take long walks on Sundays, the little bookstore where she had spent hours browsing through shelves while I stood beside her, pretending to be interested in things I didn't care about, just because I loved watching the way her face lit up when she found something new. And I realized, with a sudden, crushing clarity, that all of it was tainted now, that every memory, every moment, every place that had once been sacred to us had been irreversibly altered, and no matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to run from the truth, I would never be able to escape the fact that the life I had built, the love I had nurtured, had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, one that had shattered in an instant, leaving me with nothing but the empty, echoing silence of what used to be. I ended up at my mother's house, not because I had planned to, not because I had consciously decided that this was where I needed to be, but because in the absence of everything else, in the absence of the home that no longer felt like mine, this was the only place that still felt safe, the only place that hadn't been touched by the storm that had consumed my life in the span of a single day. And as I stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me with suffocating intensity, I barely made it to the front door before she opened it, as if she had been waiting for me, as if she knew, even without me saying a single word, that something was wrong, that I was unraveling, that I had reached the edge of something I couldn't come back from. She didn't ask me why I was there. She didn't press me for answers. She just pulled me into a hug, her arms wrapping around me in a way that made my chest tighten, made my throat close up, made me feel, for the first time in what felt like years, like I didn't have to hold it together, like I didn't have to pretend I was fine, and for a long time I just stood there, breathing her in, letting the familiarity of her presence ground me, letting myself feel the weight of everything without trying to push it down or bury it beneath forced composure. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I just stood there, letting the silence stretch between us, and then, finally, after what felt like forever, I pulled back, exhaling a shaky breath, and said the only words that mattered anymore. "It's over." She nodded, her eyes searching mine, seeing everything I wasn't saying, understanding without needing an explanation. And when she spoke, her voice was soft but certain, carrying none of the false reassurance or empty platitudes I had been dreading. "I'm proud of you." And maybe that shouldn't have meant anything. Maybe it shouldn't have carried the weight that it did. But in that moment, after everything, after all the doubt and the questions and the pain, it was the only thing I needed to hear, because it was a reminder that I had done the right thing, that I had chosen myself, that I had walked away from something that no longer served me, no longer deserved me. And even though it hurt, even though it would take time, even though I knew there would be nights where I lay awake questioning everything, I also knew, deep down, in the part of me that had always known the truth even when I didn't want to admit it, that I was going to be okay. Because I had survived the worst of it, because I had walked away from the wreckage, because I had chosen me.